5,000 years ago, in a land between two rivers, a civilization appeared, fully formed, fully functioning, as if it had been downloaded into the minds of men overnight. No slow crawl from caves. No gradual fumbling toward agriculture, toward writing, toward law. The Sumerians arrived with mathematics already in hand, with astronomy already cataloged, with a legal code already sophisticated enough to protect widows and orphans, to regulate trade, to define the rights of citizens. And they arrived with children on their minds. Not as an afterthought, not as a biological footnote. Children sat at the very center of Sumerian civilization, in their theology, in their economics, in their medicine, in their cosmic origin stories. The Sumerians wrote about children the way modern neuroscientists write about the brain, with obsession, with precision, with the understanding that everything else depends on getting this right. What they said about children is not what you expect. It is not what any of us were taught. Because what they said reaches backward into the stars, forward into the human genome, and sideways into questions that modern science is only now beginning to ask. Questions about why human children are so different from every other creature on this planet, why they are so helpless for so long, why they require what no other species requires, and what the cost of failing them truly is. What you are about to hear is not a bedtime story. It is not mythology dressed up as history. It is a careful reconstruction of what the Sumerians actually said, drawn from clay tablets, from cylinder seals, from temple hymns and royal archives and medical texts, and placed alongside what we now know from genetics, from neuroscience, from evolutionary biology, and from the strangest corners of the archaeological record. Some of it will make you uncomfortable, some of it will make you angry. Some of it will make you look at a child differently, maybe your own child, maybe yourself as a child, and understand something you have carried your whole life without having the words for it. And one thing in particular, the eighth thing, the one this entire journey is building toward, one thing may change the way you understand what it means to be human. We are going to cover 8 things the Sumerians said about children, and we are going to take them seriously, not as the superstitions of a primitive people, but as the transmitted knowledge of a civilization that knew something we have forgotten, something we buried under thousands of years of noise, something that is clawing its way back to the surface right now. This is where we begin. Not in a library, not in a university seminar. We begin in the ruins of a city that should not exist. The city is Eridu. Situated at the southern tip of ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq, Eridu is considered by most mainstream archaeologists to be the oldest city in the world. Carbon dating puts its earliest occupation somewhere around 5,400 BCE, though some researchers push that date back considerably further when they factor in the layers of occupation beneath the current excavation depth. The Sumerians themselves were more precise. Their king list, a clay tablet cataloging the rulers of Sumer in sequence, begins with these words. After the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. After the kingship had descended from heaven, 8 words. 8 words that Sumerian scribes saw no reason to explain or justify, because to them it was not mythology, it was history. It was the most important historical fact they possessed, the beginning of everything. The moment the gods came down, established civilization, and placed it in human hands. The god who established Eridu was Enki. And Enki is the god who matters most for what we are about to discuss, because Enki is the god who, according to Sumerian texts, was most involved with the creation of humanity and most invested in what happened to human children. Enki's temple in Eridu was called the Abzu, the House of the Deep Waters. Beneath it, the Sumerians believed, flowed the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean, the source of all wisdom, all magic, all creation. Enki lived in the Abzu. Enki ruled the Abzu. And from the Abzu, Enki watched. He watched children especially. This is not allegory. Across hundreds of Sumerian texts, Enki appears specifically in contexts involving the young, healing their sicknesses, protecting them from demons, ensuring the knowledge required to raise them was preserved and transmitted correctly. He is the god of wisdom and water and creation, yes, but he is also, in ways modern scholars rarely emphasize, the god of children. And what Enki said about children, what the Sumerians recorded Enki as having said about children, is what we are here to discuss. Before we go further, we need to spend a moment with the texts themselves, because the skeptical mind will immediately ask, how do we know what the Sumerians actually believed? How do we separate genuine ancient knowledge from the interpretations of modern scholars, from the wishful thinking of ancient astronaut theorists, from the natural human tendency to find meaning in ambiguous symbols? It is a fair question, and the answer is carefully. Sumerian cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing pressed into wet clay, was deciphered in the 19th century, primarily by scholars working on the Behistun inscription in Iran, a text carved in 3 languages including Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian. From Akkadian, scholars worked backward to Sumerian. The process was slow and contentious, but by the mid-20th century, Sumerian was sufficiently understood that major texts could be translated with reasonable confidence. The key word is reasonable. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no proven relatives. Some words remain ambiguous. Some passages are damaged. Some texts survive in multiple versions that contradict each other in small but important ways. The discipline of Assyriology is not perfect, and serious Assyriologists will tell you so. What this means for our discussion is the following. We will distinguish throughout between what tablets directly say, translated as accurately as current scholarship allows, and what those translations might imply, or what alternative researchers have proposed they mean. We will hold both possibilities in view simultaneously, because intellectual honesty requires it. What we will not do is dismiss the Sumerian texts as mere mythology, as primitive people's attempts to explain a world they did not understand. That dismissal has cost us 5,000 years of accumulated wisdom, and the debt is becoming visible. Let us now go into that wisdom. Let us look at the 8 things the Sumerians said about children. We start at the very beginning. We start with where they believe children came from, not where babies come from. You know where babies come from. The Sumerians knew too. They were not naive about biology. What they had, that we have largely lost, is a cosmological account of why children exist at all. Why this helpless, dependent, extraordinarily needy creature appears in the world, what it was designed to do, and who designed it. Their answer to those questions is one of the most extraordinary things ever committed to clay. The first thing the Sumerians said about children is this: they were not an accident of nature. They were an engineering decision. The Sumerian creation story is not a single text. It exists across multiple tablets, multiple traditions, multiple cities, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish, the myth of Enki and Ninmah, and dozens of smaller texts that fill in specific details. Taken together, they tell a story that should stop any honest person cold, because it does not read like mythology, it reads like a technical report. The broad strokes are these. In the beginning, the great gods, the Anunnaki, came to Earth. The texts are specific about why, to mine for gold. Specifically, to mine in the region the texts call the ZU, a location that some researchers identify as the Abzu of Enki's domain, others as Africa, and that the Zulu oral tradition of southern Africa, independently and remarkably, also associates with ancient mining operations by beings who descended from the sky. The mining was done by a lower class of gods called the Igigi. The Igigi labored for thousands of years. The texts give specific numbers, astronomical spans of time, and eventually they revolted. They had endured enough. They refused to work. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, and they threatened open rebellion. A solution was needed. Enki proposed it, and here is where the texts become extraordinary. Here is where they become something that neither pure mythology nor pure allegory adequately explains. Enki proposed the creation of a substitute worker, a primitive worker. In Sumerian, the texts call it the Lulu Amelu, literally the mixed worker, or the primitive man, a being that would bear the toil of the gods so the gods could rest. The creation procedure, as described in the myth of Enki and Ninmah, involves Enki and the goddess Ninmah working together in what is explicitly described as a biological process. The mother goddess, Ninhursag, Ninmah, Mami, she carries several names across the texts, molds the new being from clay. But the clay is not ordinary clay. The texts specify that the clay is mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god, specifically, a god whose name translates as We-Ilu, the god who has intelligence. The flesh and blood of the god who has intelligence is mixed into the clay from which the new worker is formed. Modern Sumerian scholars, mainstream scholars with no agenda beyond accurate translation, render this as a mythological account of how humans received the divine spark, how consciousness was embedded in matter. That is the standard academic interpretation. But a growing number of researchers, including some with legitimate scientific credentials, have begun to ask a different question. They are asking, what if the Sumerians were describing, in the only vocabulary available to them, an actual biological procedure? What if the mixing of the gods' genetic material into the biological substrate of an existing creature is not metaphor but memory? An ancient description of a genetic modification event so far in the past that only the broad outline survived? This is not a fringe question. This is a question that sits at the intersection of Sumerian scholarship and a set of biological anomalies that evolutionary theory has never satisfactorily explained. Here is the most significant one. The human genome contains approximately 20,000 genes. Of those, roughly 223 show no evolutionary precursors in any other species on Earth. They did not develop through the standard Darwinian process of gradual mutation and selection. They appear, as geneticist Eugene McCarthy and others have noted, to be insertions, as if they were placed there rather than grown there. Those 223 genes are involved, in large part, with neurological function, with the complexity of the human brain, with the capacity for abstract thought, for language, for planning, for, to use a Sumerian word, intelligence. We are not going to resolve this question tonight. We are not going to prove ancient genetic engineering or disprove it. What we are going to do is hold the question open, because the Sumerians themselves held it open. They did not present this as myth, they presented it as history. And the history they presented describes children not as random evolutionary products, not as biological accidents, but as beings who were specifically designed for a specific purpose by beings with specific knowledge and capability. That design, they said, included a deliberate decision about the child. Here is where it gets precise. The myth of Enki and Ninmah describes multiple attempts to create the Lulu. Some of the early prototypes were failures, beings who could not hold food, beings whose organs did not function, beings who could not reproduce. Ninmah, working somewhat drunkenly by some versions of the text, produces a series of flawed models. Enki corrects them, or finds uses for them. The process is iterative, it is experimental. Eventually, they arrive at a working model, a being that can sustain itself, that can labor, that can reproduce. But there is a catch, and this catch is critical to everything that follows. The early human cannot reproduce without assistance. The texts are explicit. Reproduction required the intervention of the birth goddess. The new workers were created in batches, in what the texts describe as birth chambers, large rooms where the birth goddess oversaw the process. Individual humans could not have children on their own. At some point, and this transition is described in several texts with a sense of drama, even of transgression, that limitation was lifted. Humans were granted the ability to reproduce independently. They were given what the texts sometimes call the me of procreation, the divine formula, the functional knowledge, the biological upgrade that allowed self-sufficient reproduction. This upgrade, the Sumerians said, changed everything. It changed the relationship between the created and the creators. It changed the nature of human children fundamentally, because now children were not produced in the controlled environment of a birth chamber, under divine supervision, according to a careful protocol. Now children were born wild, born free, born into the world, with all of their potential and all of their vulnerability exposed. And that vulnerability, the Sumerians said, was not a bug. It was a feature. It was the most important thing about the human child. It was the thing that made the human child unlike any other creature on Earth, and unlike any previous version of the created worker. And it was, and here we come to a claim that will run like a thread through everything that follows, it was deliberate. The human child was made vulnerable for a reason. To understand that reason, we need to go deeper into the Sumerian understanding of how a child works. We need to look at what they called the nam, the destiny, the fate, the essential nature of the human infant. And we need to look at what they said happens to that nam in the first years of life. What they said is this: the child arrives in the world carrying a destiny that is not yet fixed. The nam of the infant is like wet clay, capable of being shaped, capable of receiving impression, capable of becoming almost anything. This window of malleability, the Sumerians believed, was finite. It would close, the clay would harden, and what was impressed upon it during that window would remain, for the rest of that person's life, as permanent as cuneiform in fired clay. They had a specific term for the period during which this shaping occurred. We will examine that in detail when we reach the fourth thing the Sumerians said about children. But first we must look at the second thing, because the second thing explains why the first thing matters, why the design of the vulnerable child was not an accident but a calculated necessity. The second thing involves what the Sumerians believed was being built inside the child during those early years. And what they believed was being built is not what you are expecting. But before we turn to that, before we move to the second revelation, we need to spend a moment with something that mainstream scholars tend to skip over in the Enki and Ninmah narrative, something that sits in the margins of the text, but that may be the most important detail in it. After the final successful creation of the human being, after the Lulu Amelu is complete and functional, Enki makes a declaration. The tablets record it in a form that suggests it was considered liturgically significant, meant to be memorized, meant to be repeated. The declaration goes approximately like this, in the most literal translation available. The fate of the newborn was not decreed by the great gods. The fate of the newborn is written in the face of its mother. Read that again. The fate of the newborn is written in the face of its mother. In context, this is not a poetic metaphor. This is a theological statement about where the programming of the child actually occurs, not in the stars, not in the decrees of the gods assembled on high, but in the immediate, close, daily, continuous experience of the mother's face. Thousands of years later, a developmental psychologist named John Bowlby would propose attachment theory, the idea that the infant's primary relationship with its caregiver is not merely a comfort mechanism, but the foundational architecture upon which all subsequent emotional, cognitive, and social development is built. Bowlby's ideas were controversial when he proposed them in the 1950s and 1960s. They are now mainstream neuroscience. The Sumerians got there first. They got there 5,000 years before Bowlby, and they embedded the insight not in a scientific paper, but in a mythological text that most people read as a story about gods making clay figures. The fate of the newborn is written in the face of its mother. We are going to return to this idea repeatedly, because the Sumerians returned to it repeatedly. It appears in medical texts, in temple hymns, in proverbs, in legal codes. It is not a throwaway line. It is the central insight around which everything else they said about children is organized. But we have to take it step by step. Let us now turn to the second thing. The second thing the Sumerians said about children is this. Inside the child, an invisible architecture is under construction, and the builders are the people around the child. The Sumerians had a concept they called the me, pronounced roughly like may. The me were the fundamental principles, laws, and technologies of civilization, the divine formulas upon which every aspect of organized human life depended. There were me for kingship, me for music, me for mathematics, me for the descent into the underworld, me for craftsmanship, me for warfare, me for sexuality, me for wisdom, me for the power of speech. The me were not metaphors. They were described as real, transmissible things, objects that could be stolen, that could be given as gifts, that could be possessed by one city and coveted by another. In the famous myth of Inanna and Enki, the goddess of love and war travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her his mez, one by one, more than 100 of them, and carries them back to her city of Uruk, establishing Uruk as the new cultural center of Sumer. The me were, in the most accurate translation we can give, the information packages of civilization. The structured knowledge that had to be transferred from one generation to the next for civilization to persist. Without the me, civilization collapses. With them, civilization expands. And the Sumerians said something remarkable about the me as they related to children. Children were not born with them. Children were born with the capacity to receive them, with the special malleability of the infant, the wetness of the clay that we discussed, but the me themselves had to be installed. They had to be transmitted. They had to be given. The people responsible for this transmission were not, in the Sumerian worldview, teachers in the abstract sense. They were, first and foremost, parents. And then the extended family. And then the community, but parents first. This is where the Sumerian understanding of children diverges most sharply from certain modern assumptions, and where it aligns most precisely with the cutting edge of contemporary developmental science. We have, in the modern West, spent roughly 2 centuries debating nature versus nurture, asking how much of who a person becomes is determined by their genes and how much by their environment. The debate has oscillated back and forth. In the early 20th century, behaviorism dominated. The child was a blank slate, and environment was everything. B.F. Skinner famously claimed he could take any healthy infant and train it to become anything, doctor, lawyer, thief, regardless of the child's natural endowment. Then came the genetic revolution. DNA was mapped. Twin studies accumulated. The pendulum swung toward nature. Genes explained almost everything, or so it seemed. The Sumerians did not take either side of this debate, because the Sumerians understood something that the nature versus nurture framing obscures. Nature and nurture are not opposites. They are the same system. The genes do not operate in a vacuum. The genes are themselves responsive to the environment. The genes are, in a profound sense, waiting for instructions. This concept has a name in modern science. It is called epigenetics, and it is one of the most significant discoveries in biology of the past 30 years. Epigenetics is the study of changes in gene expression that do not involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence. In other words, your genes are not a fixed program running a predetermined output. Your genes are more like an instrument, and the environment, particularly the early environment, plays them. The same genetic sequence can produce vastly different outcomes depending on what signals the environment sends during critical developmental windows. What signals? Primarily relational signals. Hormonal signals generated by close physical contact, by the consistency of care, by the quality of attention, by the emotional tone of the primary caregiver. Cortisol levels, the stress hormone, are profoundly shaped in infancy by the quality of the attachment relationship, and cortisol levels shape, in turn, which genes are expressed in the developing brain. Neglect, abuse, chronic stress, and emotional unavailability in infancy do not just cause psychological damage. They cause epigenetic changes that alter the physical structure and chemical environment of the developing brain. These changes can persist across a lifetime. They can even, and this is among the most extraordinary findings in modern biology, be transmitted to the next generation through epigenetic inheritance. The trauma of the parent literally shapes the gene expression of the child before the child is born. The Sumerians did not know the word epigenetics, but what they described aligns with stunning precision. In the Sumerian medical corpus, the texts recovered primarily from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which preserved much earlier Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge. There are extensive passages dealing with what we would call developmental disorders in children. The causes listed for these disorders are revealing. Some are supernatural, demons, malevolent spirits, the evil eye. We expect that from an ancient people. But alongside the supernatural causes, appearing with equal weight and equal seriousness, are relational causes. A child who is not seen by its mother, the Sumerian phrase is complex, but it refers to something like emotional unavailability, the mother's gaze not landing with recognition. A child who is startled without comfort, meaning a child who experiences fear without the subsequent regulation provided by a caring adult. A child whose voice has not been answered, meaning a child whose communications, its cries and its gestures and its early vocalizations have not received consistent and appropriate responses. These are not random items in a list of curses. They are a developmental theory. They describe, in the language of 2,000-year-old Mesopotamian medicine, what modern neuroscience calls the serve and return interaction, the back-and-forth communication between infant and caregiver that builds neural circuitry. When the child makes a bid, a sound, a gesture, a look, and the caregiver returns the bid with a response, a neural connection is reinforced. When the bid goes unanswered, the connection is not made. Do this enough times, in either direction, and you have either a well-wired brain or an underwired one. The Sumerians called the well-wired brain the result of proper me transmission. They called the underwired brain the result of me deprivation. And they considered me deprivation not merely a personal tragedy but a civilizational threat, because a child who does not receive the me cannot transmit them. The invisible architecture, left unbuilt, leaves a gap in the chain of transmission that cannot be filled later. This is why the second thing the Sumerians said about children is so serious. They were not describing a preference or a parenting style, they were describing a structural requirement of civilization. The invisible architecture inside the child is civilization, encoded in a human being, transmitted person to person, parent to child, across the generations. Civilization does not live in texts or in temples or in laws. Civilization lives in children, in the quality of what was built inside them during the window when building was possible. When that window closes, and it does close, the Sumerians were insistent on this, what was built is what remains. The clay is fired. The impression is permanent. Now there is something in the Sumerian text that complicates this picture, and it would be dishonest not to address it. Because the Sumerians did not believe the me were purely natural, purely human in origin. They believed the me were divine. They came from the gods, from the Anunnaki, and specifically from Enki, and they came with what the texts sometimes describe as an expiration risk. There are passages, fragmentary, damaged, difficult to translate, in which Enki expresses concern about what happens when humans no longer receive the me through proper channels. When the transmission is interrupted, when generations pass without the invisible architecture being properly built, the language in these passages is stark. One translation renders it approximately as, "A generation without the me is a generation that has returned to the clay, formless, without purpose, without the likeness of the divine in its face. A generation that is returned to the clay." That phrase haunts several researchers in this field, and it will haunt us too. because it suggests that the Sumerians understood something about civilizational collapse that we have yet to fully absorb. Something about what happens when the transmission of the invisible architecture fails across enough generations, when enough children grow up underbuilt, when the clay hardens around an absence rather than a presence. We are going to return to this. But first, we need to look at the third thing, because the third thing is where the Sumerian understanding of children becomes most controversial, most uncomfortable, and most relevant to the world we currently inhabit. The third thing the Sumerians said about children involves time. Specifically, it involves what they believed time did to the human child that it did to nothing else, and why that fact was, in their cosmology, the key to everything. Human children take an extraordinarily long time to mature. This is not a new observation. Any biologist will tell you that the human developmental period is anomalously extended compared to every other primate and most other mammals. A chimpanzee, whose genetic similarity to us runs at approximately 98.7%, is sexually mature at around 8 years and fully cognitively adult shortly after. An elephant, one of the most intelligent animals on Earth, with a brain that dwarfs ours in sheer mass, reaches sexual maturity between 10 and 15 years. A human being does not complete brain development until approximately age 25. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, moral reasoning, and the regulation of emotion, is the last part of the brain to mature. It does not finish wiring until the mid-20s. Why? Evolutionary biology offers answers that are technically satisfying but philosophically thin. The big brain hypothesis: the human brain is so large that it cannot pass through the birth canal fully developed, so it is born early relative to other primates and continues developing outside the womb. The social brain hypothesis: the complexity of human social structures requires a longer learning period to master. The cultural transmission hypothesis: humans have so much culturally accumulated knowledge to absorb that the biological learning period had to be extended to accommodate it. These explanations have merit, but they raise a further question that evolutionary biology struggles with. Why is the human brain so large in the first place? Why does our species require a social structure so complex that it demands a 15-year learning period? Why did cultural accumulation suddenly begin happening in our lineage, and only in our lineage, among all the hominids, at a rate that outpaced genetic evolution by several orders of magnitude? The standard answer is that it just did. Random mutations led to incremental advantages that were selected for across hundreds of thousands of years, and the result was us. It is a plausible story. It is also, in the eyes of a significant and growing number of researchers, an incomplete one. The Sumerians had a different explanation for why human children take so long to develop. Their explanation was grounded in what they called the divine portion, the tila in some texts, the aspect of human beings that was contributed by the slain god in the creation narrative. The divine portion, they said, was not fully inherited. It was not fully transmissible through genetics alone. It had to be grown, activated, cultivated. The presence of the divine portion in the human child meant that the child was not merely an animal to be kept alive and fed until it could survive on its own. The child was a project, a complex, time-sensitive, environment-dependent project that required sustained, specific input from other conscious beings to reach its full potential. And that potential, the Sumerians said, was not merely practical, it was cosmic. We will come to that. We will come to what the Sumerians believed the fully developed human being was actually for, what role they believed we were meant to play in the larger structure of the cosmos. But we cannot get there without first going through the third and fourth and fifth things, because those are the things that describe how the project works, and what goes wrong when it doesn't. The third thing the Sumerians said about children is this: time, in the life of a child, is not evenly distributed. Some moments matter more than others. Some windows are open that will never be open again. Miss them, and you miss them forever. The Sumerians called these windows by a term that translates roughly as the seasons of formation, and they treated them with the reverence that farmers in Mesopotamia treated planting seasons. You do not plant wheat in the wrong season and expect a harvest. You do not attempt to shape the child's invisible architecture in the wrong season and expect it to take root. To understand how sophisticated the Sumerian conception of these windows was, we need to look at a specific group of texts that most popular accounts of Sumerian civilization completely ignore. These texts are not the dramatic creation myths, not the Epic of Gilgamesh, not the hymns to Inanna. They are the practical texts, the instructions given to midwives, to mothers, to wet nurses, to temple physicians. They are the working documents of a civilization that took the raising of children with deadly seriousness. What these texts describe, once you read them in sequence and allow the underlying theory to become visible, is a developmental timeline. A sequence of windows, each with its own requirements, its own vulnerabilities, its own type of input that must be provided for the next window to open correctly. The first window the texts describe begins at birth, immediately at birth. The language used is urgent. The infant must be placed against the mother's body without delay. The texts specify skin contact. They specify that the mother's heartbeat, which the infant has known for 9 months, must continue to be accessible to the infant in the immediate aftermath of birth. They specify that the first milk, what we now call colostrum, has properties beyond mere nutrition, that it carries something of the mother into the child that cannot be provided in any other way at any other time. We now know what they were describing. Colostrum is dense with antibodies. It establishes the infant's immune system. But it also contains hormones, growth factors, and chemical signals that help regulate the infant's nervous system in the first critical days of extrauterine life. The skin-to-skin contact they specified triggers the release of oxytocin in both mother and infant, establishing the neurochemical foundation of the attachment relationship. The sound of the mother's heartbeat, as modern research has confirmed, reduces cortisol in the newborn and promotes organized sleep architecture. The Sumerians did not know any of this at a biochemical level. But they described the outcomes. They described what happens to children who receive these things and what happens to children who do not, with sufficient precision that the practical instructions they left were correct. The midwife texts are particularly striking. One passage, recovered from tablets found at Nippur and translated by the Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer in the mid-20th century, contains what appears to be a medical protocol for the immediate post-birth period. The language is partly ritual, invoking Ninhursag, the birth goddess, but embedded within the ritual language is what can only be read as a practical procedure. Do not separate the infant from the mother. Allow the infant to seek the breast on its own. Do not hurry this. The time it takes is necessary. What is happening in this time cannot be seen, but it is the most important thing that will happen in this child's first year of life. What is happening in this time cannot be seen, but it is the most important thing that will happen in this child's first year of life, written more than 4,000 years ago. Confirmed by research published in the last 20 years. The synchrony is not coincidental. It cannot be. Either the Sumerians discovered this through long observation and careful record-keeping across generations, or they received this information from somewhere else. Both possibilities are extraordinary. The second window described in the Sumerian developmental sequence is harder to pin to an exact age in our terms. The Sumerians did not think in months and years the way we do. But the texts describe it as the period when the child begins to speak, its first asking. When the child begins making intentional communicative bids. When it begins pointing and looking and vocalizing with clear intent to communicate, not merely to express distress. We now call this period the prelinguistic communication phase. It begins around 7 or 8 months and extends through the second year of life. It is the period during which the serve and return interaction is most critical for building the neural architecture of language, of social cognition, of what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have minds, that their inner experience may differ from your own, that communication is a sharing of interior worlds. The Sumerian texts describing this window are the ones that contain the phrase we noted earlier. The fate of the newborn is written in the face of its mother. The face of the mother, specifically, the responsiveness of that face, the way it mirrors and extends and responds to the child's expressions and communications, is not merely a source of comfort. It is the primary data input for the child's developing social brain during this window. The texts go further. They describe what happens when the mother's face is not responsive, when it is flat, expressionless, unavailable. The language used is stark. The child's speaking-seeking goes silent. It closes in on itself. It stops reaching outward and turns inward. The tami of the child, the connection threads, as one translation renders it, begin to withdraw. Edward Tronick, a developmental psychologist at Harvard, conducted an experiment in the 1970s that has become one of the most cited demonstrations in all of developmental science. It is called the still face experiment. A mother sits across from her infant and engages normally, smiling, talking, responding to the baby's cues. Then, on a signal, the mother's face goes completely still, expressionless. She looks at the baby but responds to nothing. The results are immediate and disturbing. Within seconds, the infant begins escalating its bids, smiling more, vocalizing more, reaching toward the mother, trying to restore the connection. When this fails, the infant turns away, exhibits signs of acute distress, curls inward, begins to disengage. Some infants reach a state of what researchers call learned helplessness within minutes. When the mother's normal responsiveness is restored, it takes time for the infant to recover. The terror of the unresponsive face does not simply evaporate. The Sumerians describe this exact sequence. They describe the escalation, the withdrawal, the turning inward, and they describe the long-term consequences. A child whose asking speaking has been consistently met with an unresponsive face becomes, in their terms, a child whose me cannot take root. The invisible architecture cannot be properly built because the builder, the responsive caregiver, is not there to receive the child's inputs and return them in transformed, enriched form. The third window described in the Sumerian texts is the most complex, the most extended, and the one that has attracted the most attention from researchers working in the ancient astronaut tradition, because it contains the most explicit references to what appears to be a cosmological purpose for child development. This window corresponds roughly to what we would call the toddler years, the period from approximately 18 months to 5 or 6 years of age. The Sumerians identified this as the period of Nam formation, the setting of destiny, the crystallization of the child's essential nature. The Nam, in Sumerian cosmology, is not exactly fate in the passive, predestined sense. It is closer to what the ancient Greeks would later call eudaimonia, flourishing, becoming what you are most deeply meant to be. But unlike the Greek concept, which unfolds through reason and virtue across an entire lifetime, the Sumerian Nam was understood to be substantially shaped, substantially determined, in those early years. The clay of the child's being was most malleable during the Nam formation window. After this window closed, the impressions made in it would be very difficult to change. The texts give instructions for this period that are extraordinary in their specificity. Children in the Nam formation window should be spoken to in complex language, not baby talk, but the full language of adults, even if the child cannot yet fully understand it. This is because the child's brain, the texts suggest, is listening at a level beneath conscious understanding, absorbing the structure, the rhythm, the relational patterns of language even before it can decode the content. Research published in 2003 by Betty Hart and Todd Risley, and replicated multiple times since, found that the single strongest predictor of a child's vocabulary at age 3, and consequently of their academic success across their entire school career, is the number of words spoken to them by adults in the first 3 years of life. Children in language-rich environments heard approximately 30 million more words by age 3 than children in language-poor environments. The gap this created in cognitive and linguistic development was not merely a delay, it was a structural difference that persisted into adulthood. 30 million words. The Sumerians did not count words, but they described the principle behind the count. They said in multiple texts and multiple ways that speaking to the child during the Nam formation window is not a luxury, not a comfort, not something you do when you have time. It is the primary task of the parent. It is the mechanism through which the me are transmitted. It is the building of the invisible architecture. And they made something else clear about this period that is worth pausing on, because it cuts against a deeply embedded, modern assumption. The Sumerians said that during the Nam formation window, the child should not be alone, not separate, not handed to strangers who do not carry the family's me. The child should be in continuous proximity to the people who love it, to the parents, to the grandparents, to the extended family. Because the me are not transmitted through any mechanism that can be formalized, institutionalized, or delegated. They are transmitted through presence, through the lived experience of being in relationship with people who carry the me and who are transmitting them continuously, unconsciously, through the 10,000 small interactions of daily life. This is not an argument against education. The Sumerians valued formal education. The Adaba, the tablet house, was a respected institution in Sumerian cities. But the Adaba was for older children, children who had already received their Nam formation, whose invisible architecture was already substantially built, who were ready to receive formal instruction because they had the cognitive and emotional foundation to use it. Sending a child to the Aduba before the Nam formation window had closed was, in the Sumerian view, backwards. It was like trying to carve a design into wet clay at the wrong stage of drying. The clay would absorb the pressure and collapse rather than hold the impression. The fourth thing the Sumerians said about children is directly connected to this, because it is about what happens when the pressure is applied at the wrong time, in the wrong way, by the wrong hands. It is the most disturbing thing in the entire set of 8. And it requires us to go to a part of the Sumerian texts that most researchers prefer not to spend too much time with. Because this is where the Sumerians talk about what goes wrong with children, what was already going wrong in their own time, and what they feared would go on going wrong across all the generations that followed them if the warning embedded in their texts was not heeded. They were not wrong to be afraid. The fourth thing the Sumerians said about children is this: there are things that break the child at the root, and they named them. This section of the Sumerian corpus is not comfortable reading. It is not comfortable to write about. But it is necessary. Necessary because the Sumerians included it in their sacred texts for a reason. And the reason was not to satisfy historical curiosity. The reason was warning. Active, urgent, ongoing warning. A warning written in clay so it would last. Because the people writing it knew that what they were warning against was not an aberration of their time. It was a chronic condition of the human situation, one that would recur and recur and recur until it was understood and named and systematically resisted. Let us begin with what they called the three poisons. The first poison was Namtar, fate destruction. In the Sumerian worldview, the Nam, the destiny of the child, was not immutable. It could be damaged. Specifically, it could be damaged by chronic, unpredictable threat, what we would now call chronic stress or trauma in childhood. The texts describe Namtar in clinical terms: a child subjected to repeated frightening experiences without subsequent comfort and resolution develops what the texts call a fractured Nam, a destiny that cannot cohere, that cannot form itself into a stable shape because the formative clay has been damaged by excessive force before it could set. The neuroscience of childhood trauma confirms this with precision. The developing brain, particularly in the first 5 years of life, is exquisitely sensitive to stress hormones. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, is highly functional in short, acute doses. It sharpens attention, mobilizes energy, prepares the organism for threat response. But in chronic, unrelenting doses, particularly when the child lacks the caregiver support necessary to regulate the stress response, cortisol becomes toxic to the developing brain. It damages the hippocampus, the brain's primary memory formation structure. It dysregulates the HPA axis, the hormonal system that governs the stress response itself. It physically alters the architecture of the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, emotional regulation, moral reasoning, and long-term planning. A child whose developing brain has been exposed to chronic, unmitigated stress does not merely have psychological problems. That child has a different brain than a child who grew up in safety and security. A different physical brain, built with different proportions, wired with different default settings, tuned to a world of threat rather than a world of exploration and connection. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study, conducted by Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda, beginning in the 1990s, is the most comprehensive epidemiological examination of childhood trauma ever conducted. It followed more than 17,000 adults and correlated their health outcomes as adults against the number of categories of adverse childhood experiences they had encountered: abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, parental mental illness, domestic violence, parental incarceration, substance abuse in the household. The results were, in the words of one of the researchers, so clear and so powerful that they were hard to believe. Adults with 4 or more adverse childhood experience categories showed, compared to adults with none, a 460% increase in the risk of depression, a 1,220% increase in the risk of attempting suicide, a 240% increase in the risk of sexually transmitted infections, a 390% increase in the risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, higher rates of heart disease, cancer, liver disease, and autoimmune disorders, lower educational attainment, lower lifetime income, higher rates of incarceration, shorter life expectancy. These are not psychological outcomes. These are physiological outcomes. The trauma of childhood is literally embodied. It lives in the organs, in the immune system, in the cardiovascular system, in the structure of the brain itself. The Sumerians called this Namtar, the fracturing of destiny at the root, and they listed its causes with uncomfortable clarity: violence in the household, fear without comfort, the witnessing of adult aggression, the experience of being abandoned, the experience of hunger without being fed, and, listed separately but with equal weight, what they described as the removing of the child from the web of knowing faces. The web of knowing faces. This phrase comes from a temple hymn dedicated to Ninhursag, the birth goddess, and it refers to something the Sumerians understood that we are only beginning to relearn. The developing child's brain is built for, calibrated to, and dependent upon the presence of a web of familiar faces. Not one face, a web. Multiple generations, multiple relatives, multiple adults who know the child by name and by nature, who carry the child's history in their memory, who reflect the child back to itself from multiple angles, giving it a complex, rich, multidimensional sense of who it is. The modern term for this is alloparenting. Anthropologists studying traditional human societies and evolutionary anthropologists reconstructing the environments in which human development evolved have concluded with remarkable consistency that the human child evolved to be raised not by a single parent but by a network of caregivers, what Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, in her landmark book Mothers and Others, calls cooperative breeding. The human infant, with its extraordinary neediness and its extraordinarily long developmental period, would have been impossible to raise alone. It required a village. It evolved to require a village. Its nervous system developed to receive input from multiple familiar adults, to be regulated by multiple attachment figures, to receive the me, in Sumerian terms, from multiple sources simultaneously. What we have done, in the modern industrialized world, is remove the village, the nuclear family, the isolated household, the geographic mobility that separates children from grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles and neighbors who have known them since birth. These are not natural arrangements. They are historical aberrations, barely 2 centuries old, imposed by an economic system that valued the mobility of labor above the continuity of community. And they have consequences that we are only beginning to tabulate. The removal of the child from the web of knowing faces. The Sumerians named it as a cause of Namtar, fate destruction, 4,000 years ago. They saw it happening even then, in the disruptions caused by warfare, by the collapse of city-states, by the forced relocations of conquered peoples. They saw children being separated from their communities, and they cataloged what it did to those children. And they included that cataloging in their sacred texts because they understood it was not merely a historical observation, it was a prophecy. The second poison the Sumerians named was ashaga, a term that has been translated variously as the abandonment of the inner, the emptying of the self-knowing, or, in the most arresting translation I have encountered, the silencing of the child's own voice within itself. This is a subtle concept, and it requires care to explain. The Sumerians did not mean literal voice. They were not describing children who had been shamed or punished for expressing themselves, though that is one pathway to ashaga. They were describing something deeper, the experience of a child whose inner perceptions, whose emotional reality, whose sense of its own experience, are systematically contradicted by the adults around it. The child who is told it is not cold when it is cold, not afraid when it is afraid, not sad when it is sad. The child whose perceptions of family dynamics are consistently denied, who knows, with the absolute certainty of a child's raw, unfiltered perception that something is wrong in the household, but who is told again and again that nothing is wrong, that everything is fine, that it is imagining things, that it is too sensitive, that it is wrong. This experience, which psychologists now call invalidation, and which in its more extreme forms shades into what is called gaslighting, does not merely cause emotional pain. It causes a specific kind of structural damage to the child's developing sense of reality. The child's inner perceptions are its primary instrument for navigating the world. Those perceptions need to be calibrated against external reality to function correctly. The calibration happens through the responses of trusted adults. When trusted adults systematically miscalibrate the instrument, when they tell the child that what it is perceiving is wrong, the instrument breaks. The child stops trusting its own perceptions, stops trusting itself. And this loss of self-trust is, as the Sumerian texts warn, extraordinarily difficult to repair. The third poison named in the Sumerian texts is the one that has attracted the most interest from researchers working in the ancient astronaut tradition, because it appears to reach beyond psychology into something more cosmological. The texts call it Dingirnami, which translates roughly as the forgetting of the divine origin, or, in a more controversial rendering, the severing from the Anunnaki inheritance. Within the mainstream Assyriological tradition, this is interpreted as a religious concept, the importance of children understanding their relationship to the gods, of being raised within the religious and mythological framework that gives Sumerian civilization its moral and cosmic coherence. Children who are not taught who they are in the cosmic order, who are not given the origin story, the sense of sacred lineage, the understanding that they carry something of the divine within them, grow up, the texts say, like clay without a potter's mark, unable to be identified, unable to find their place, unable to understand what they were made for. The alternative interpretation, which we will not dismiss but will hold carefully, is that Dingirnami refers to something more literal, a forgetting of actual genetic and cosmological origins, a deliberate or inadvertent suppression of the knowledge that human children carry specific inherited capacities, the divine portion, that need to be recognized, cultivated, and understood if they are to develop fully. This interpretation is supported, its proponents argue, by the text's consistent pairing of Dingernomy with specific outcomes, the failure of what they call the higher me, the elevated information packages, the ones associated with wisdom, with the capacity to communicate across large distances, with what one tablet calls the knowing that goes before the face, which some researchers read as something like precognition or non-ordinary perception. When children are raised without knowledge of their divine origin, the higher me fail to activate. The child develops the lower functions, survival, basic cognition, social navigation, but not the higher ones. The higher ones require acknowledgement. They require cultivation. They require someone to look at the child and say, "You carry something that most people never see," and then to show the child how to see it. This, the Sumerians said, was the deepest form of neglect, deeper than physical deprivation, deeper than emotional abandonment, deeper even than trauma. To fail to show the child what it carries inside it, to raise a child as if it were merely an animal, a body to be kept alive, a worker to be trained, is to commit the oldest possible betrayal. It is to complete the namtar that the gods themselves warned against. We are going to come back to the higher me. They are at the heart of the eighth thing, the one thing every parent should know. But before we can get there, we have to work through the fifth, sixth, and seventh things, because they build the bridge. The fifth thing the Sumerians said about children involves something that might seem surprising given everything we have discussed so far. It involves play, and it turns out the Sumerians had a more sophisticated theory of play than most modern psychologists do. The fifth thing the Sumerians said about children is this: play is not the opposite of work. Play is the highest form of work that a child can do. And to deprive a child of play is to deprive it of its primary mechanism for becoming fully human. This requires us to look at a set of Sumerian texts that are often treated as charming curiosities: the lullabies, the children's riddles, the descriptions of children's games recovered from various Mesopotamian sites. These texts have been analyzed primarily by scholars interested in what they reveal about daily life in ancient Sumer. What they reveal about what the Sumerians believed about child development has received far less attention. Let us look at some of what these texts contain. There are tablets that list children's games, games involving balls, games involving running, games involving imitation of adult activities. There are tablets that describe children's toys, miniature boats, animal figures made of fired clay, spinning tops, dolls with movable limbs. There are descriptions of children wrestling, of children role-playing as merchants and farmers and judges, of children reenacting the myths of the gods. Taken together, these texts describe a childhood that was rich in unstructured, child-directed, imaginative play. And they describe adult attitudes toward this play that are striking. The adults in these texts are not supervising the children's play, not directing it, not correcting it, not trying to make it educational in any formal sense. They are allowing it. They are watching from a distance with what the texts describe as something like reverence. In one passage that has become something of a touchstone for researchers in this area, a father is described watching his young son play. The son is constructing an elaborate mud city, building walls, placing figures inside, enacting conflicts and negotiations between the figures. The father says nothing. He watches. And the text includes his internal reflection, a rare literary device in Sumerian writing, which goes approximately, "He is learning what I cannot teach him. He is building the knowing that will make him a man." I would be a fool to interrupt this with my lesser wisdom. He is learning what I cannot teach him. He is building the knowing that will make him a man. This is not the attitude of a civilization that sees children as small adults to be kept busy with useful tasks until they are large enough to do real work. This is the attitude of a civilization that understands play as a distinct category of activity with a distinct developmental function, a function that cannot be replicated by any other means, and that adults are not equipped to fully understand or direct. Modern developmental science has arrived at essentially the same conclusion, through a route that took several hundred years of debate and experimentation. Jean Piaget, the Swiss developmental psychologist whose work dominated the field for much of the 20th century, described children's play as the primary mechanism through which children construct their understanding of the physical and social world. Not learn information, construct understanding. There is a difference. Information can be transmitted by telling. Understanding can only be constructed by doing, by acting on the world, observing the results, and integrating the outcomes into an increasingly sophisticated internal model. Vygotsky, Piaget's great Soviet contemporary and sometimes rival, added the social dimension. Play is not merely how children construct understanding of the world, it is how they construct understanding of themselves in relation to others. The zone of proximal development, Vygotsky's term for the space between what a child can do alone and what it can do with assistance, is best explored in the context of play, where the child can try on roles, test rules, experiment with power and submission, practice empathy and negotiation and conflict resolution without real-world consequences. Stuart Brown, a contemporary researcher who spent decades studying play across species, including human play across the lifespan, concluded that play is not a luxury and not merely preparation for adult competence. Play is, in his terms, the primary biological mechanism through which the brain organizes itself. The neural circuitry of executive function, of creative problem-solving, of social cognition, of emotional regulation, all of it is built and refined primarily through play. An animal or a child deprived of play does not merely miss out on fun. It develops with structural deficits in the brain systems that play is designed to build. The Sumerians did not need Stuart Brown to tell them this. They watched children play, and they understood, with the observational acuity of a civilization that had been watching children for generations, that what was happening in play was irreplaceable, that it was sacred. That to interrupt it or to replace it with premature formal instruction or with productive labor was to commit one of the three poisons, was to begin the fracturing of the Nam before the clay had finished setting. And yet the Sumerians were also a practical people. They ran cities, they maintained armies, they conducted trade across vast distances, they built irrigation systems and administered temples and educated scribes. They needed productive citizens. And the tension between the child's need for free play and the society's need for trained workers was as real in ancient Sumer as it is today. How they resolved this tension is instructive. The Sumerian approach, as reconstructed from the texts, appears to have had two distinct phases. The first phase, corresponding roughly to what we would call early childhood, up to approximately age 7, was characterized by an almost total privileging of the child's play. The child during this period was not expected to perform useful work, was not subjected to formal instruction in skills, was not removed from the family and community environment that provided the web of knowing faces. The child played. It was protected, fed, spoken to in complex language, embedded in a rich web of relationships, and allowed to play. Then, beginning around age 7, and the texts are quite specific about this transition, marking it as a genuine developmental threshold, the child began a gradual transition into the adult world. Not an abrupt insertion, a gradual, scaffolded, apprenticeship-style entry. The child began accompanying adults in their work, began learning skills by watching and then by doing, alongside a master, began receiving formal instruction in the tablet house. But the play did not stop. It changed in character, becoming more structured, more complex, more skill-focused, while retaining the essential quality of child-directed exploration. What the Sumerians never did, as far as the texts reveal, is what we now do routinely. Remove children from their family and community environments at age 3 or 4, place them in groups of same-age peers, supervised by strangers with no biological investment in them, and subject them to formal cognitive instruction that their developing brains are not yet equipped to receive. Developmental researchers have a name for this mismatch. They call it developmental asynchrony, when the demands placed on a developing system are out of step with the developmental stage of that system. The results of chronic developmental asynchrony range from increased stress responses to reduced motivation, to learn to outright regression in emotional and cognitive development. We are producing developmental asynchrony at industrial scale. We have been doing so for roughly a century, and the outcomes are visible in the epidemiological data on childhood mental health, on educational disengagement, on the rising rates of anxiety and depression in children and adolescents across the industrialized world. The Sumerians warned against this. They warned against it in the language available to them, the language of divine design, of the three poisons, of the proper and improper seasons of formation. They said, the child has a nature. That nature has requirements. Those requirements have timing. Violate the timing and you damage the nature. You fracture the Nam. You produce a generation that has returned to the clay, formless, without the full activation of its divine portion, unable to transmit the me to the next generation. There is one more dimension of the Sumerian theory of play that we need to examine before we move on, because it connects directly to the sixth thing. It involves what the Sumerians believed happened in the child's imagination during play, and why they considered the imagination not a faculty of entertainment or escapism, but a faculty of genuine knowing. In Sumerian cosmology, the imagination, the capacity to construct internal images of things not present in physical reality, was not a distinctly human capacity. It was the defining capacity of the divine. The Anunnaki, in the creation narratives, did not stumble accidentally upon the human design, they imagined it first. They held it in their minds, in what the texts call the divine seeing, the mu unzu, and then they constructed what they had imagined. Creation, in the Sumerian worldview, is imagination made physical. When a child plays, when a child constructs an imaginary city in the mud, when a child takes a stick and calls it a spear and enacts a battle, when a child makes a doll speak and negotiates between the doll and another doll, the child is doing something that the Sumerians considered sacred. The child is exercising the divine faculty, the mu unzu, the capacity that links human beings to the creative intelligence of the Anunnaki. The capacity that, if developed and cultivated during the play-rich years of early childhood, would become the foundation of everything that distinguished the fully realized human being from the mere animal. The capacity to imagine what does not yet exist and then bring it into existence. The sixth thing the Sumerians said about children is about what this capacity becomes when it is fully developed. When the invisible architecture is properly built, when the Nam is properly formed, when the play has done its work, when the child is ready for the next stage. The sixth thing is about initiation. And it is one of the most misunderstood aspects of ancient life, and one of the most desperately needed in the modern world. The sixth thing the Sumerians said about children is this: at a certain moment, the child must be called across a threshold, not pushed, not dragged, called, by the community, by ceremony, by the explicit acknowledgement of the adults around the child that the child has become something it was not before, and that the world now relates to it differently. This is what we call initiation. And the Sumerians took it with a seriousness that makes our modern vestigial equivalents, graduation ceremonies, driver's licenses, bar mitzvahs, as they are now typically practiced, look like what they are, pale shadows of something that once mattered enormously. To understand why the Sumerians considered initiation so important, so structurally necessary, not merely ritually traditional, we need to go back to the concept of the Nam and the invisible architecture. The Nam, recall, is substantially formed during the early years. The invisible architecture is built during the critical windows of childhood. But built for what? The Sumerians were explicit. The architecture is built for a purpose that cannot be revealed to the child too soon. The me that are installed during childhood are preparation. They are not the thing itself. They are the container that will eventually hold the thing, the higher purpose, the cosmic role, the full activation of the divine portion. And the transition between preparation and activation requires a ceremony. It requires witnesses. It requires the community to come together and say, "We see what you have become. We name it. We claim it. We will now relate to you on the basis of what you are, not what you were." Without this ceremony, without this communal naming, something fails to fully activate. The container was built, but was never officially opened. The me are present, but have not been formally engaged. The young person moves through the world carrying an unsanctioned identity, an unnamed power, a capacity that no one has officially recognized, and therefore that the young person cannot fully trust in themselves. This is not mysticism, this is social neuroscience. The brain is a social organ. It does not operate in isolation from the perceptions and recognitions of other brains. Specifically, the developing brain of a young person is exquisitely sensitive to the social mirror, to what it sees reflected back from the faces and behaviors and explicit communications of the adults around it. Identity is not constructed in isolation. Identity is co-constructed in the space between the self and the witnessing community. You do not know who you are, fully, stably, with the kind of certainty that allows you to act from that knowledge, until someone who matters tells you what they see. This is why, in the absence of genuine initiation, young people create their own gang initiations, drug initiations. The high-risk behaviors of adolescence that serve, however maladaptively, as tests of identity and as bids for communal recognition. The desire to be initiated is biological. It is developmental. It is hardwired into the adolescent nervous system. If the community does not provide it in a form that transmits the me, in a form that builds on the invisible architecture of childhood and activates the higher capacities, the young person will create their own version, and the results are almost never good. The Sumerian initiation process, as reconstructed from temple records and the mythological texts that were used in these ceremonies, was not a single event. It was a sequence, a period of preparation, a period of challenge, a moment of threshold crossing, and a period of integration. What we would call initiation today, a one-day ceremony, a party, a certificate, covers only the moment of threshold crossing. And even that is largely drained of its developmental content. Let us look at what the Sumerians included. The preparation period began before the child was ready, meaning it began while the child was still in the play-rich years, and it consisted of the gradual increase of responsibility, the gradual introduction to the knowledge base of the adult world, and, critically, the first formal teachings about the origin story, about who the Sumerians were, about who their gods were and what their gods had done, about the divine portion within the human being and what it was designed to do. This was not indoctrination in the modern pejorative sense, not the suppression of critical thinking in favor of dogma. The Sumerian texts that contain these teachings are complex, nuanced, full of internal contradiction and paradox. They require thought. They require the young person to hold ambiguity and to work through it. The origin story is not simple. The gods are not simply good. Enki and Enlil are in constant tension. Inanna is terrifying and generous and ruthless and loving. The cosmos is not designed for human comfort. It is designed for something more interesting and more demanding. This complexity is intentional. The teaching function of these stories is not to provide answers. It is to develop the capacity to hold and work with difficult questions. The questions about who we are, where we came from, what we owe to each other, what we owe to the cosmos. These are the questions that the initiate will need to be able to live with for the rest of their life. The preparation period is when they begin to learn how. The challenge period of Sumerian initiation is described in several texts as involving some form of ordeal, physical hardship, isolation from the community, a confrontation with fear. The specifics vary across time and across cities. But the underlying structure is consistent. The young person must encounter their own limits, must face something genuinely difficult without the protection of childhood, must discover in themselves the resources that were built during the first phase of life. This is the moment when the invisible architecture is tested, when the Nam meets genuine adversity and either holds or fractures. And the Sumerians believed that this test was not merely diagnostic, not merely a way of finding out what was there. It was itself a final stage of construction. The encounter with genuine difficulty, properly held by the community around the initiate, completed something that the earlier years of protected development had prepared but could not finish. Joseph Campbell, drawing on Van Gennep's structure of the rite of passage, described this process in terms that align very closely with the Sumerian texts: separation from the known world, descent into the ordeal, return with the boon. What Campbell called the hero's journey is, at its root, a mythological encoding of the initiation process, a narrative template given to cultures to explain to young people what they were about to undergo and why. The hero's journey is not a story about extraordinary individuals. It is a description of what every human being must go through to become fully themselves. The Sumerians knew this. They embedded it in their mythology precisely because they wanted every young person to understand that what they were undergoing in initiation was the same pattern enacted by the gods themselves, that Inanna's descent into the underworld, that Gilgamesh's journey beyond the edge of the world, that Enki's journey through the waters of the Abzu. These were not stories about exceptional beings doing exceptional things. They were instruction manuals for the ordinary human life. The threshold moment of Sumerian initiation, the actual moment of crossing, was conducted in public, before witnesses, with ceremony, with specific ritual language that named what the young person had been and what they were becoming. Several tablets preserve fragments of this language, and they are among the most moving things in the Sumerian corpus. One fragment from a text associated with the temple of Ninhursag at Adab reads approximately, "Child of clay, child of the mothers of Sumer, you have walked in the first world. You have played in the light of the gods. Now you cross. Now you enter. Now we see you in your fullness, and we name what we see. You are no longer the child who is given to us by the gods to keep. You are the keeper. You carry the me now. You carry them forward. Do not let them fall. You are no longer the child who is given to us by the gods to keep. You are the keeper." This is what initiation does, in the Sumerian understanding. It does not merely mark a transition, it transfers a responsibility. The young person who was the recipient of the community's care and attention and me transmission during childhood becomes, through initiation, a transmitter, a keeper, someone who now owes to the next generation what was given to them by the previous one. This is the mechanism of civilizational continuity, not texts, not laws, not institutions, people. People who receive something understand what they received and feel the obligation, the sacred obligation, to transmit it forward. The chain of transmission is the civilization. When the chain breaks, the civilization breaks. When enough links in the chain are weak, when enough initiates were never fully initiated, when enough keepers never fully received what they were supposed to keep, the chain snaps, and what is lost may take centuries to rebuild, if it is rebuilt at all. The integration period following the threshold crossing is described in the texts as a gradual re-entry into community life in the new role. The young person is no longer treated as a child by anyone. The web of knowing faces now looks at the young person differently, sees them differently, addresses them differently, calls on them differently. And this social recognition the Sumerians understood is not a courtesy. It is a developmental necessity. It is the final stage of the activation of the higher me. Without it, the crossing remains incomplete, because identity is co-constructed, and the young person cannot fully inhabit the new identity until the community fully inhabits it with them. Modern culture has nothing equivalent to this. We have gestures, graduations, coming-of-age parties, first jobs, legal age thresholds, but none of these involve the community seeing the young person in their fullness and making an explicit, witness declaration of that seeing. None of them involve the transmission of responsibility. None of them complete the circuit between the individual and the community that the Sumerian initiation process was designed to complete. And the cost of this absence is visible in the face of every adult who has never been genuinely initiated, who carries somewhere beneath the functional competence of adult life the uncrossed threshold. The part of them that is still waiting to be seen and named. The part that is still, in some developmental sense, the child in the first world, playing in the light, waiting for someone to come and say, "It is time. We see you. You are ready. Cross." The seventh thing the Sumerians said about children takes us somewhere unexpected. It takes us away from development and initiation and towards something more cosmological, more explicitly connected to the ancient astronaut material that frames this entire investigation. The seventh thing is about what the Sumerians believed children could do that adults had largely lost the capacity for. And it is, if the interpretation holds, one of the most radical claims in the entire ancient literature. The seventh thing the Sumerians said about children is this: the child, in the early years before the clay hardens, sees what adults can no longer see, and what the child sees is real. This is the most contested claim in the Sumerian child literature, and the one that most sharply divides the mainstream Assyriological perspective from the ancient astronaut interpretation. Let us lay both out fairly. In the mainstream reading, this is a religious and anthropological observation, one that has parallels in virtually every ancient culture on Earth. Children are closer to the divine, to the spirit world, to the numinous, because they have not yet been fully socialized into the rational structures that adults use to filter and organize perception. The child's animism, the attribution of consciousness and agency to all things, the ability to experience wonder without the mediation of category and concept, is understood by mainstream scholars as a developmental phase, not a genuine perceptual capacity. Children see spirits and gods because children have not yet been taught not to. When they grow up and are taught the adult categories, the spirits and gods disappear. This is a perfectly respectable interpretation. It is also, in a deeper sense than its proponents usually acknowledge, a story about what is lost in the process of socialization, and whether what is lost might be real rather than imaginary. The alternative interpretation, which takes the Sumerian texts at closer to face value, is this: the child's perceptual field is genuinely wider than the adult's. Not because of developmental immaturity, but because of neurological freshness, because the developing brain has not yet completed the process of selective attention that defines adult consciousness. Adult human perception is extraordinarily selective. We perceive a tiny fraction of the sensory information available to us at any moment, filtered by attention, by expectation, by category, by the 10,000 cognitive shortcuts that make efficient adult functioning possible. Children, particularly very young children, have less filtering, less expectation, less categorical organization. Their perceptual field is, in a technical sense, wider, more inclusive, less pre-sorted, more open to inputs that the adult brain would automatically screen out. Whether this wider field includes access to anything genuinely real that adult perception misses, or whether it is simply unfiltered noise, undifferentiated experience that adults correctly learn to tune out, is a question that sits at the frontier of consciousness research and that has not been definitively answered. The Sumerians had an answer, and their answer was, the child sees real things. The child's wider perception is a feature, not a bug. It is part of the divine portion, the capacity inherited from the gods who have broader perceptual access than ordinary humans. And this capacity, if recognized and cultivated rather than dismissed and educated away, is one of the higher me, one of the elevated information packages that the fully realized human being is supposed to carry. What do they say children see? The texts are various. Some describe children as being able to see the personal protective spirits, the Lama and the Shedu, that accompany each human being. These are sometimes rendered in English as guardian angels, though the Sumerian concept is considerably more specific and mechanistic. The Lama and Shedu are not metaphors for conscience or moral guidance. They are described as distinct entities, assigned to each human being at birth, whose function is to facilitate the connection between the individual human and the larger divine order. They are, in effect, the individual's link to the Anunnaki network. Adults, the texts say, can sometimes sense their Shedu in dreams, in moments of sudden inspiration, in the uncanny coincidences that Jungian psychology would later call synchronicity. But children, particularly very young children, can see them directly, can interact with them, can receive from them information that has not come through the normal sensory channels. Some tablets contain what appear to be specific instructions for working with this capacity in children. Not for exploiting it or using the child as an oracle, the texts are clear that this would be a violation of the child's development, but for honoring it, for not denying it, for responding to the child's reports of what it sees with the seriousness appropriate to genuine communication rather than the dismissal appropriate to fantasy. One passage, in a medical context, warns explicitly against telling a child that what it has seen is not real. The language is stark. To tell the child that the real is unreal is one of the three poisons. It is a shaga, the silencing of the child's own voice within itself, applied to the deepest level of perception. A child whose reports of non-ordinary perception are consistently denied and dismissed does not merely stop reporting. The perception itself, the texts suggest, eventually shuts down. The window closes prematurely, and a capacity that might, in a rightly ordered environment, have developed into something of genuine value to both the individual and the community is lost. This is an extraordinary claim. It is also, unexpectedly, a claim that has received some support from the most unlikely of directions. Research into exceptional human experiences, a field that has moved from the periphery of psychology toward a somewhat more central position over the past 2 decades, has consistently found that adults who report non-ordinary perceptual experiences, variously called mystical experiences, peak experiences, anomalous perceptions, or in more clinical language, unusual phenomenological states show, on standardized measures of well-being, creativity, and life satisfaction, outcomes that are significantly above average. The mystical experience is not, on the evidence, a sign of pathology. It is, on the average, associated with better outcomes. What is more relevant for our purposes is what happens to people who, as children, had such experiences and were either supported or dismissed. The research here is smaller. This is a harder population to study, but the pattern that emerges is consistent. Children whose early non-ordinary perceptions were supported, not exploited, not dramatized, but quietly honored and held as real, tend to integrate those experiences in ways that enrich their adult lives. Children whose early non-ordinary perceptions were denied or pathologized tend to experience one of 2 outcomes. Either they shut the experiences down and grow into adults who are cut off from a dimension of their experience, or they are unable to shut the experiences down and grow into adults who are flooded by them without the cognitive framework to integrate them. The Sumerian understanding addresses both of these outcomes. The texts suggest a middle path. Acknowledge the child's wider perception as real. Do not dramatize it. Do not deny it. Create a framework, the cosmological framework of the Anunnaki origin, the divine portion, the me, within which the child can understand what it is perceiving and how it fits into the larger order of things. Give the child the vocabulary and the context before the perception becomes overwhelming or before the social pressure to deny it becomes irresistible. This is, in essence, what initiation does as well. It gives the young person the framework within which to understand and integrate their full experience, including the dimensions of experience that adult rationality would normally screen out. The preparation period of initiation, which we discussed in the 6th section, included explicit teaching about non-ordinary perception, about dreams, about the communications of the Shedu, about the significance of what arrives in the liminal states between waking and sleeping, between the ordinary activities of the day. This teaching did not exist to create a class of mystics. It existed because the Sumerians understood that non-ordinary perception, properly integrated, contributes to the highest human capacities: creative problem-solving, moral vision, the ability to perceive patterns that ordinary sensory experience does not reveal. Enki's wisdom was not merely practical intelligence. It was a form of perception that could see the deeper structure of situations, the hidden connections between things, the possibilities that lay behind the apparent surface of reality. And Enki's wisdom in human beings was seeded by that same capacity. Born with the child, present in its widest form in the early years, available to the adult only if it had been cultivated and honored during the window when cultivation was possible. The loss of this capacity at the civilizational level, the systematic suppression, across centuries, of childhood non-ordinary perception, through the insistence that such perception is pathological or imaginary, is, in the view of the researchers who take the Sumerian texts most seriously, one of the most significant self-inflicted wounds in human history. We have been cutting out the very faculty that was, in the Sumerian understanding, the most precious part of our divine inheritance. And we have been teaching children to cut it out themselves, by telling them that what they see is not real. There is a Sumerian proverb, preserved in a collection of sayings recovered from the site of Nippur, that reads approximately, "The child who points at the star knows its name. The adult who follows the child's finger finds the star but has forgotten what to call it. The child who points at the star knows its name." This is not merely poetic. In the Sumerian cosmological framework, knowing the name of something is not a linguistic act. It is an ontological act. It is knowing the essential nature of the thing, the mu, the deep identity that underlies its appearance. The idea that children, in their freshness of perception, have access to the essential natures of things before the adult categories have been imposed, before the filtering mechanisms of socialized consciousness have been installed, is one of the most radical and most consistently underappreciated claims in the entire Sumerian corpus. And it leads directly to the eighth thing. The thing that everything we have covered so far has been building toward. The thing that, if it is understood and acted upon, changes what it means to be a parent, and perhaps what it means to be a human being. The eighth thing is about the parent, not the child. Because the seventh thing, the child sees what adults can no longer see, turns out to be the inverse of what most people expect. Most people, when they think about the relationship between children and adults, think of adults as the ones with the knowledge, and children as the ones who need to receive it. And this is true in important respects. The adult carries the me. The adult builds the invisible architecture. The adult conducts the initiation. The adult creates the conditions within which the child can play and develop and eventually cross the threshold. All of that is true, but the Sumerians said something more. They said something that went in the other direction. Something about what the child gives the adult, what the child does for the adult, what the child makes possible that the adult cannot make possible for themselves. And that something is the eighth thing. It is the one thing every parent should know, and it may be the most important thing in this entire investigation. It is not a discovery that requires ancient tablets to explain. It is written in the experience of every person who has ever looked into the eyes of a newborn child and felt something shift inside them that they did not expect and could not fully explain. The Sumerians gave that experience a name. They gave it a structure. They gave it a cosmological significance. And then they wrote it in clay, so it would last. This is what they wrote. The eighth thing the Sumerians said about children is this: the child does not only need the parent needs the child. Not in the sentimental sense. Not the way we say, my children complete me, or I don't know what I would do without them. In a specific functional developmental sense. In the same sense that the child needs the parent in order to build the invisible architecture, the parent needs the child in order to access something in themselves that cannot be accessed any other way. This is the thing. This is the revelation. This is what they wrote in clay, what they embedded in their medical texts and their temple hymns and their mythological narratives, what they return to again and again across 5,000 years of recorded Sumerian thought. The child is not a project. The child is a mirror. And the mirror shows something that no other mirror can show. Let us go slowly here, because the Sumerian concept is precise, and the precision matters. In the myths of Enki and the creation of humanity, there is a moment that most translations gloss over because it seems like a minor narrative detail. After the creation is complete, after the Lulu Amelu is walking and breathing and functioning, Enki does something unexpected. He does not simply step back and assess the product. He looks into the face of the created being. The Sumerian word used for this looking is a special one. It is not the ordinary word for seeing or observing. It is the word that describes the divine gaze, the same gaze that, in Sumerian theology, gives life to things, that makes things real by perceiving them. The gaze that says, I see you, therefore you exist. Enki looks into the face of the first human being with the divine gaze. And the text says, in a passage that most translators render as a poetic flourish, but that some researchers insist is a cosmological technical specification, that in the human face, Enki sees his own reflection. Not a diminished reflection, not a pale imitation, a genuine reflection of something divine. Enki, in the moment of looking at what he created, is changed by what he sees. This is extraordinary in a theological context. In most ancient mythologies, gods create things and the creation goes in one direction. The god's power flows outward into the created object. The created object receives, the god gives. The transaction is unidirectional. But in the Sumerian texts, in this specific passage, and in several other places that echo it, the transaction is bidirectional. The creator is changed by the created. The seer is changed by what is seen. Why does this matter for parents and children? Because the Sumerians said that this same dynamic is present in every genuine parent-child relationship. The parent who truly sees the child, who looks at the child with what the texts call the migrah, the true seeing gaze, the seeing that is also a receiving, is themselves changed by what they see. Specifically, they are changed in a direction that the Sumerians considered the most important direction available to a human being, toward the divine portion within themselves. The child, in its freshness, in its unfiltered being, in the divine portion not yet overlaid by socialization, reflects back to the parent something that the parent has lost. Something the parent put away when they crossed the threshold of initiation, when they took on the weight of the me and became a keeper and transmitter rather than a receiver. The child reflects back the original nature, the nature before all the shaping, before all the narrowing, before all the decisions about who to be and who not to be that accumulate across a lifetime and gradually bury the nam under the rubble of experience. The Sumerians had a concept for this reflection. They called it the me returning, the sending back of the me to the one who originally held them before they became fixed and habitual and unconscious. When a parent truly sees a child, not the child they want the child to be, not the child they are afraid the child is, not the child who reflects their own anxieties and ambitions back at them, but the actual child in front of them, the parent receives, in that moment of true seeing, a transmission that goes in the opposite direction from the normal flow. The child transmits the me back to the parent. Not all of them. Not the complex, culturally encoded me of adult civilization, the foundational ones. The ones that were present before the shaping began. The ones that have been buried deepest. What are these foundational me? The texts describe them in ways that are harder to translate precisely, because they are not skills or capacities in the ordinary sense. They are closer to what we might call qualities of being: wonder without explanation, presence without agenda, willingness to receive without immediately interpreting, the ability to encounter something, another person, a situation, the world itself, without the protective mediation of concept and category. These are the qualities that children have naturally, that adults have largely lost, and that the highest spiritual traditions of every culture spend lifetimes trying to recover. Buddhism calls it beginner's mind. Christianity calls it becoming like a little child. The mystical traditions of Islam and Judaism and Vedanta all have their versions of the same insight, that the enlightened state is in some sense a return to the freshness of the child's perception, purified and integrated rather than abandoned. The Sumerians did not present this as a spiritual achievement for the few. They presented it as a developmental opportunity for every parent. The child is not merely a receiver of the parent's wisdom. The child is the mechanism through which the parent's wisdom is kept alive, through which the parent's own divine portion is maintained in active relationship with its source, rather than gradually drifting into the fixed, habitual, increasingly narrow territory of socialized adult consciousness. This is why the Sumerian texts are so emphatic about the quality of the parent's presence in the child's life. Not merely the quantity, not merely being physically present, being there, providing care and safety, the quality, the attention, the willingness to actually see the child rather than to manage it. A parent who is physically present but mentally and emotionally absent, distracted, preoccupied, performing the functions of care without the presence of genuine seeing, does not receive the me returning. The transmission requires both parties to be genuinely present. The child's transmission is always happening, it cannot be turned off, it is simply what the child is doing by being what it is. But the parent's reception requires a particular kind of attention, undefended, unagenda-ed, genuinely curious about who this specific being in front of them actually is. The loss of this attention, the parent's capacity for genuine seeing, is named in several texts as one of the deepest possible tragedies of human life. Not merely for the parent, though it is tragic for the parent, for the child. Because a child who is not truly seen, who is managed, supervised, provided for, directed, corrected, but not actually seen, is a child who cannot transmit the foundational me to the parent, and therefore cannot fully receive back the confirmation that the divine portion is real and valuable and worth protecting. The me returning flows in both directions. The child needs to give the me to the parent as much as the parent needs to receive them. And when the reception is blocked, when the parent is not truly present, the child loses not only the comfort of being seen, but the developmental experience of being a source of genuine value to another person. This is a dimension of child development that our current frameworks almost entirely miss. We talk about the child's need for attunement, for co-regulation, for attachment security. We talk about these needs as one-directional. The child needs these things from the parent. But the Sumerians understood that the child also needs to provide. The child needs to be received as a giver, not only as a receiver. The child needs to experience itself as a source of something real and valuable, not merely as a recipient of adult provision, but as a contributor to the adult's development. When children are treated as projects, as problems to be solved, as developmental stages to be managed, as potential future achievers to be optimized, they are deprived of this experience. They are positioned as passive recipients. And the developmental consequence is subtle but significant. Children who are never experienced as givers, who never have the experience of their essential being received with genuine appreciation by an adult who needed what they offered. These children develop, in adult life, a particular kind of poverty of self, a sense that they do not at their core have anything of genuine value to offer the world. That they must perform, achieve, optimize, become, that simply being what they are is not enough. This is the deepest wound in modern culture. It is more widespread than any of the named pathologies in the psychiatric manuals. It is so widespread that it is largely invisible. It is the background condition of contemporary life, the default setting of a civilization that has forgotten the me returning, and the Sumerians named it. They named it clearly, and they located its origin precisely, and they described its consequences with an accuracy that should command our attention even across 5,000 years. Let us go deeper into what the texts say about what the parent receives from the child when the reception is genuine. There is a hymn, attributed to a king named Shulgi of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, who ruled around 2100 BCE, that contains an extended meditation on the experience of holding his newborn child. Shulgi was a literate king, unusually so, who wrote hymns himself rather than merely commissioning them. And in this hymn, he describes looking into his child's face with what can only be described as a mystical experience. The language is dense, and the translation is disputed, but the core content is clear. Shulgi reports that in looking into his child's face, he sees, and here the text uses the divine gaze vocabulary we noted earlier, he sees the Abzu, the primordial waters, the deep source beneath everything, the place where Enki dwells, where all creation originates, where the me are kept before they are distributed into the world. He sees the Abzu in the face of his child. What does this mean? In a strictly literary reading, it means that the child embodies the primordial creative principle, that new life reflects the original creative power of the cosmos. This is a beautiful and significant poetic statement. In the more literal reading that the ancient astronaut tradition tends toward, it means something more specific, that the child's face, in the moment of the parent's true seeing, reveals the source, the origin, the Anunnaki connection that underlies the human being, and that is normally invisible beneath the overlay of socialization and conditioning. The child is closest to the source. The child has not yet moved far from where it came from. And in looking at the child with the divine gaze, the parent can see, however briefly, however partially, the origin that they share with the child, the divine portion in both of them, meeting at its source. This experience, which Shulgi describes as simultaneously humbling and exhilarating, as the most significant thing that has ever happened to him despite his considerable experience of power and achievement and battle, this experience is what the Sumerians said every parent can have, and what every parent who is truly present with their child will eventually have. And having it, they said, changes things. Not metaphorically, structurally. The parent who has truly seen the Abzu in the face of their child cannot continue to relate to the child as a project, cannot continue to see the child merely as a developmental task to be managed. The child is now revealed as something else, as a being who carries within it the source of everything, including the source of the parent's own deepest self. And the parent's relationship to their own deepest self is irrevocably altered by the encounter. The Sumerians called this alteration the key tag, the touching of the ground. a landing, a return to foundation. The parent who has been touched by the child's me returning has been returned, however briefly, to their own ground. To the Nam that was formed in their own childhood, before all the overlays. To the divine portion that was always there, always transmitting, always waiting for the right conditions in which to be recognized. The right conditions are the conditions created by a child who is seen, who is received, who is given enough safety and attention and genuine presence that its own foundational nature can be fully expressed, and therefore fully transmitted back to the parent who is present to receive it. This is the circle. This is what the Sumerians said was at the center of the human enterprise. Not agriculture, not architecture. Not mathematics or law or astronomy, remarkable as those achievements are. At the center is this circle. The parent transmits the me to the child, and the child transmits the source back to the parent. The parent grounds the child in civilization, and the child grounds the parent in origin. The adult keeps the me alive and transmits them forward, and the child keeps the divine portion alive and transmits it backward toward the source, backward toward the place where Enki waits in the Abzu with all the me that were ever given, backward toward the beginning. When this circle is functioning, when parents are truly present with children, and children are truly received by parents, and the invisible architecture is being properly built, and the Nam is forming correctly in the seasons of formation, and play is sacred and initiation is genuine, and the web of knowing faces is intact, when all of this is functioning, the Sumerians said, civilization is alive. The chain of transmission holds. The me flow forward. The divine portion is renewed in each generation. The human project, the great project, the project that Enki designed and Ninhursag built and the gods descended from heaven to set in motion, that project continues. When the circle breaks, when parents are absent or distracted or managing rather than seeing, when children grow up without the web of knowing faces, when the play-rich years are shortened and the seasons of formation are violated and the initiation never comes, when the circle breaks, something dies. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a way that is easy to diagnose. The civilization continues in a form. Cities continue. Economies continue. Technologies continue. But the living core, the ongoing renewal of the divine portion, the continuous return to origin through the face of the child, that goes quiet. The clay returns to formlessness. The generation that should have been the keepers becomes instead a generation of the lost. People who carry the shape of the me without the content. People who go through the motions of civilization without knowing what the motions were for. The Sumerians were afraid this would happen. They were afraid of it enough to commit the warning to clay, to repeat it across hundreds of tablets, to encode it in their myths and their medical texts and their proverbs and their hymns. They were afraid of it because they had seen in their own time the early signs. The disruptions of warfare and population movement and the gradual erosion of the temple institutions that had maintained the circle were already visible in the late Sumerian period. The scribes who preserved these texts were preserving them against a threat they could see coming. They were right to be afraid. The circle has been broken, in the modern world, at a scale the Sumerian scribes could not have imagined. We have produced, in the past century and a half, the most comprehensive disruption of the child-rearing conditions that human biology requires in the history of our species. We have removed children from extended family networks. We have replaced the web of knowing faces with institutions staffed by strangers. We have abbreviated the play-rich years and extended formal instruction downward into developmental windows that are not designed to receive it. We have eliminated genuine initiation and replaced it with nothing that carries equivalent developmental weight. We have systematically denied and pathologized non-ordinary perception in children. We have positioned parents as service providers rather than seers, children as projects rather than sources, the family as a logistical unit rather than a sacred circle. And the results are in the data. They are in the rising rates of childhood anxiety and depression. They are in the epidemic of adult loneliness, the loss of community, the collapse of intergenerational relationship. They are in the narrowing of perception and the atrophying of imagination and the disappearance of wonder that is visible across the culture. They are in the number of adults who, when asked what they truly feel at the center of their experience, describe a kind of emptiness they cannot explain, a sense that something fundamental is missing, something that should be there but is not, something they cannot name because the culture has not given them the vocabulary for it. The Sumerians gave us the vocabulary. It is the me returning. It is the key tag. It is the Abzu in the face of the child. It is the divine portion, unactivated, waiting for a parent who is present enough to see it and willing enough to be changed by what they see. The one thing every parent should know is this: your child is not only receiving from you, your child is giving to you. It is giving you the most fundamental thing available to a human being: access to the source, return to origin, renewal of the divine portion in both of you simultaneously. But only if you are present, only if you see, only if you are willing, in the moment of genuine seeing, to be changed by what you find there. The Sumerians called this the Great Reciprocity. They considered it the foundation of all other reciprocities, of all the obligations and gifts and mutual dependencies that weave human society together. If this one is right, all the others have a chance of being right. If this one is broken, the others eventually unravel. This is why they wrote it in clay. Not so scholars could study it 4,000 years later, so parents could know it 4,000 years later, so the circle could be maintained, so the chain could hold, so the divine portion, in its long journey through the generations, would not be lost. They wrote it for you. We have gone through all 8 things, but to stop there would be to give you only half the picture. Because the 8 things exist within a larger context, a context that the Sumerians never let their audience forget, and that context is the question that underlies everything in the forbidden history tradition. The question is this: if the Sumerians are describing real events and real beings when they describe the Anunnaki, if the creation of the Lulu Amelu was a real engineering event, if the divine portion in human beings is a real biological feature inserted by beings with the technological capacity to do so, then the 8 things they said about children are not merely wise observations about child development. They are something more urgent. They are maintenance instructions. Instructions for the ongoing care of a designed system. Instructions for keeping the design functioning as intended. Instructions for not losing, across the generations, the specific features that were installed at great cost and for a specific purpose. This changes the stakes considerably. Let us sit with this for a moment. The Sumerian texts do not present the Anunnaki creation of humanity as ancient history in the sense of something that happened and is now finished and complete. They present it as an ongoing relationship. The Anunnaki did not create the Lulu Amelu and then depart, leaving the creation to its own devices. They created the Lulu Amelu and continued to be involved through the temple system, through the institution of the divine king, through specific individuals who maintained communication between the Anunnaki and the human community. The temple, in the Sumerian worldview, was not primarily a place of worship in the modern sense, a place where humans went to honor a distant god. The temple was a communication point, a node in a network, a place where the interface between the Anunnaki and humanity was maintained, where the me were updated and renewed, where the human administrators of the Anunnaki's ongoing project on Earth received their instructions. The Anunnaki project, as the texts describe it, evolved over time. The early project was explicitly about resource extraction, the gold mining that required the Lulu Amelu in the first place. But the text suggests that the project changed, that somewhere in the relationship between the Anunnaki and their creation, something unexpected developed, a complication, a development that the original project did not anticipate and that altered its goals. What developed, the texts suggest, was the human being's capacity for autonomous meaning-making. The divine portion, specifically the piece contributed by the god of intelligence, the slain Wee-Ilu, whose flesh and blood was mixed into the creation, turned out to produce something more complex than the Anunnaki had intended. The Lulu Amelu did not merely labor. It asked questions. It made art. It loved its children in ways that exceeded the functional reproductive requirements of the project. It dreamed. It grieved. It looked up at the stars and wanted to know what it was looking at. This was unexpected. And the Anunnaki, according to the texts, were not all agreed on how to handle it. Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, the lord of the air and of authority, was consistently troubled by what the human being had become. Several texts portray Enlil as wanting to limit, control, and periodically reduce the human population. He is associated with the Great Flood, the Sumerian flood narrative that predates and likely inspired the biblical story of Noah, which is presented in some texts as Enlil's attempt to correct a situation that had gotten out of hand. Enki, the creator, the one most directly invested in the Lulu Amelu as a project, consistently protected the human creation. In the flood narrative, it is Enki who warns Atrahasis, the Sumerian Noah, about what is coming and tells him how to survive. Enki's protection of the human being is not merely sentimental. The text suggests that Enki had come to understand something about what the human being had become that Enlil had not. Something that made the human being more valuable than the original project specification suggested. What Enki understood, the texts imply, was this: the divine portion had not merely granted human beings extra intelligence. It had granted them a specific developmental architecture, the extended childhood, the neurological malleability, the dependence on relationship and culture and transmission that made human beings uniquely capable of something that no other creature, and perhaps no Anunnaki, could do as effectively. Human beings, uniquely, could carry and transmit knowledge across time in a way that accumulated. They could build on the learning of previous generations. They could innovate on accumulated cultural capital. They could, given the right developmental conditions, the right invisible architecture, the right me, the right initiation, the right maintained circle between parents and children, develop capacities that exceeded their starting specification. The divine portion was not a fixed quantity. It was a seed, and under the right conditions, that seed could grow into something that even Enki had not fully anticipated when he designed it. This is the claim that most mainstream scholars find most difficult to engage with, and that the ancient astronaut tradition finds most compelling, that the human developmental project is open-ended, that we are not a finished product, that the design of the human child, the vulnerability, the dependency, the long developmental period, the malleability, all the things that look like weaknesses from an evolutionary perspective, and that the Sumerians explicitly linked to the divine portion, all of this was intentional, designed to produce a being that could continue to develop, that could exceed its initial design parameters, that could, under optimal conditions, grow into something that would surprise even its creators. If this is true, then the 8 things the Sumerians said about children are not simply parenting advice. They are the maintenance protocol for a species that is still in development. They are the instructions for keeping the developmental program running correctly, so that the long-term project, whatever that project is, whatever Enki intended when he looked into the first human face and was changed by what he saw, so that the long-term project can continue. And the warning embedded in those instructions is correspondingly grave. If the maintenance protocol fails, if the developmental conditions are systematically degraded, if the invisible architecture is systematically underbuilt, if the circle between parents and children is systematically broken, then the species does not merely fail to develop, it regresses. The divine portion, insufficiently cultivated, does not simply remain dormant. It begins, across generations of insufficient transmission, to fade. The thing that makes human beings uniquely capable of their extraordinary developmental trajectory begins to disappear. The generation that should have been keepers becomes instead a generation of clay, capable of sustaining basic civilization, but not of the higher me, not of the divine portion fully activated. This is a profound and terrifying claim. It is also a claim that is visible, if you know what to look for, in the epidemiological and cultural data of the contemporary world. Let us look at some of what the data shows. The Flynn effect, named after researcher James Flynn, described a remarkable phenomenon across the 20th century. Average measured IQ increased, in most developed countries, by approximately 3 points per decade. People were, on average, getting smarter over time, as measured by the dominant cognitive tests of the era. Then, around the turn of the 21st century, the Flynn effect began to reverse. In Norway, Denmark, Finland, France, the UK, Germany, and Australia, the countries with the most robust longitudinal data, average IQ scores began to decline, slightly, at first, then more steeply. The reversal is now sufficiently well documented that it has its own name, the negative Flynn effect, or in some academic discussions, the Flynn reversal. The causes are debated. Some researchers point to environmental factors, lead, microplastics, endocrine disruptors. Some point to the changing demographics of who is having children. Some point to changes in education. Some point to screen time and the replacement of complex, extended, multi-generational family interaction with the flattened, rapid-fire, shallow stimulation of digital media. The Sumerian framework suggests that all of these factors may be symptoms of a single underlying cause, the systematic degradation of the developmental conditions that human intelligence requires. The reduction of the play-rich years, the erosion of the web of knowing faces, the loss of genuine initiation, the absence of the parent's true seeing, the circle broken. What is declining in this framework is not merely measured cognitive performance. What is declining is the activation of the divine portion across the population. The higher me are being lost, not because the genetic capacity for them has disappeared, but because the developmental conditions necessary to activate that capacity are no longer being provided. The Sumerians would have recognized this decline. They described it. They named it. They called it the generation that has returned to the clay. And they wrote the 8 things precisely so that this could be reversed. Precisely so that any person, at any moment in history, who stumbled across the warning and understood it, could begin, in their own household, with their own children, to restore the conditions, to rebuild the circle, to rebuild the invisible architecture, to keep the chain of transmission alive for one more generation while the larger culture figures out what it has forgotten. This is why the eighth thing, the one thing every parent should know, is the most important. Because it is the one that is most within the control of any individual parent, regardless of the cultural context they are embedded in. You cannot, alone, restore a genuine initiation tradition. You cannot, alone, rebuild a web of knowing faces if the extended family has been scattered and the community has been dissolved. You cannot, alone, stop the institutional forces that have abbreviated the play-rich years. But you can be present. You can see. You can look at your child with the divine gaze, with the migra, the true seeing, and receive what the child is transmitting. You can allow yourself to be changed by what you see. You can look for the abzu in the face of your child, and when you find it, you can let it touch the ground beneath all your adult certainties and return you, however briefly, to your own beginning. This act, this single, simple, radical act of genuine presence, is what the Sumerians said is the foundation of everything else. Without it, all the correct parenting techniques, all the developmental wisdom, all the understanding of NAM formation and seasonal windows and the three poisons, all of it is information without transmission. Knowledge without the current running through it. With it, with that genuine presence, that willingness to see and be changed, the rest follows naturally. Because a parent who is truly present with a child understands, from the inside, what the child needs, not from a book, not from a developmental checklist. From the direct experience of receiving what the child is transmitting, the divine portion in the child communicates. It communicates everything it needs. What it needs is a parent who is receiving. That is the maintenance protocol. That is what was written in clay. That is the one thing. Be present, see, receive, be changed. And in being changed, change the world. One invisible architecture at a time, one circle completed at a time, one divine portion activated at a time, across all the generations that come after, for as long as the clay lasts, and the river runs, and children look up at stars and point and know their names. Now let us step back even further. Let us look at the broader picture that emerges when we take all 8 things together, not as a list of parenting tips, not as a developmental checklist, not even as a set of warnings about what has gone wrong in the modern world. Let us look at what the Sumerians were painting, in the aggregate, across all their texts about children. They were painting a picture of what the human being is for, not in the narrow sense of what individual humans are supposed to accomplish in their individual lives. In the cosmic sense, in the sense of the whole species, the whole project, the whole design, the human being, in the Sumerian view, is the universe's mechanism for knowing itself. Not the only mechanism. The Anunnaki know themselves. The gods of other cultures know themselves. But the human mechanism is unique, uniquely suited to a particular kind of knowing that requires the peculiar combination of the divine portion and the extended developmental window, and the dependence on relationship, and the capacity for language, and the ability to accumulate cultural knowledge across generations. This kind of knowing is what happens when a parent looks into a child's face and sees the abzu. It is what happens when a child points at a star and knows its name. It is what happens in the moment of genuine initiation when the community says, "We see you." It is what happens when play reaches its highest pitch and the child, entirely absorbed in creation, touches the muanzu, the divine seeing, and makes something that has never existed before. These moments are not decorative. They are the point. They are what the design is for. They are what Enki saw when he looked into the first human face and was changed. He saw the universe looking back at itself through a new kind of eye. An eye that had his intelligence in it, yes, but also something that he had not put there. Something that emerged from the interaction of the divine portion with the extraordinary vulnerability and dependency of the human developmental architecture. Something that is, in the truest sense of the word, creative, that creates new forms of knowing that did not exist before. This is the great project. This is what was set in motion in Eridu, when the kingship descended from heaven, and the first city was established, and the first children were born into the first web of knowing faces. This is what all 8 things are in service of, and this is what is at risk. Not the species. The species will survive in some form, almost certainly. Not civilization. Some version of civilization will persist. What is at risk is the activation, the full deployment of what human beings are designed to do. The full flowering of the divine portion across the population. The completion of the project that was begun in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago by beings who were invested enough in its outcome to write it all down before they left. They left. The texts are clear that the Anunnaki departed, that the period of direct divine governance of human civilization came to an end, and that the humans were left to maintain the project themselves. This is the meaning of the transition from divine kingship to human kingship in the Sumerian king list. The gods descended from heaven to manage things directly, and eventually they withdrew, leaving the management to the humans they had trained. They left the maintenance protocol. They left it in the myths and the medical texts and the proverbs and the hymns. They left it in the 8 things. They left it in the one thing. And they trusted. They had to trust, because the project requires it. They trusted that the humans would be present enough, would see clearly enough, would maintain the circle long enough for the thing that was started to continue toward wherever it was always going. We are those humans. The chain goes from Eridu to here. The me that were given to the first human community have been passed forward, however imperfectly, however broken and restored and broken again, across every generation between them and us. And the chain arrives here, in this moment, in this question. Are we present enough to see? We have been working through the Sumerian texts, and we have arrived at an extraordinary destination. But we have been working almost entirely with translated words. We need to step away from the texts for a moment and look at the physical record, the archaeology, the genetics, the anomalies and the material evidence, because the physical record contains something that the textual record alone cannot provide. It contains corroboration, not perfect corroboration, not proof in the legal or scientific sense, but patterns. Patterns in the physical evidence of the ancient world that align with what the Sumerian texts describe in ways that are too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. Let us begin with what the archaeological record tells us about childhood in ancient Sumer, and then move outward to the more controversial material. Excavations at Sumerian sites, at Ur, at Uruk, at Nippur, at Lagash, have produced a consistent picture of childhood that aligns very precisely with what the texts prescribe. Children's toys found at these sites are abundant and varied. Rattles, pull toys, miniature animals, small carts, balls, and, in quantities that archaeologists find remarkable, objects that seem designed specifically for imaginative play rather than for any practical or educational purpose. There are small clay figures of fantastical creatures. There are miniature furniture sets. There are tiny cooking implements, all of them crafted with care and quality that suggests they were valued objects, not throwaway items. The care given to these toys, the quality of their manufacture, the frequency with which they appear in graves alongside their child owners, tells us something important. The people who made them considered childhood play significant enough to invest real craft in the tools for it. This is not a civilization that was grinding children into productive labor as early as possible. This is a civilization that was protecting a space for play, curating it, resourcing it. The graves themselves tell a more complex and sometimes painful story. Child burials at Sumerian sites show a range of treatments that track, in interesting ways, with the social complexity of the texts. Some children were buried with extraordinary care, with jewelry, with amulets, with grave goods that suggest their community considered their loss of profound significance. Others were buried with less ceremony but still with clear intentionality. The pattern of burial goods across different periods of Sumerian history shows changes over time that archaeologists read as changes in economic circumstance and social organization, but that might also be read as changes in the cultural valuation of childhood. This matters because the Sumerian texts describe across the long arc of their civilization a gradual erosion of some of the practices they most valued. Later, Sumerian texts are more anxious than earlier ones, more concerned with the possibility of civilizational collapse, more focused on preservation of knowledge that seems to be at risk of being lost. The anxiety is palpable in the scribal schools of the late Sumerian period. There is a quality of urgency in the copying and recopying of earlier texts, as if the scribes understood that they were in a race against forgetting. The physical record of childhood practice in Sumer shows a corresponding trajectory. The earlier periods show evidence of the child-centered, play-rich, family-embedded childhood that the texts prescribe. The later periods show evidence of increasing pressures on these conditions. Earlier enrollment in the tablet house, more instrumental treatment of childhood, a narrowing of the play space. The erosion was real, and it is visible in the clay. Now let us move to the more controversial corroborations. The first involves the human genome. We touched on this earlier. The 223 genes with no apparent evolutionary precedent, the genes associated primarily with neurological complexity. But there is more to say about these genes in the context of what the Sumerians said about children specifically. Several of these anomalous genes are active specifically during particular developmental windows. They are not uniformly active across the lifespan. They switch on at certain periods of childhood development and switch off again, or modulate significantly, as development proceeds. This means that whatever function they serve, that function is tied specifically to the developmental process. It is not a constant background function. It is a window-specific function. This is exactly what the Sumerian texts would predict. If the divine portion, the component contributed by the slain god of intelligence, operates through specific developmental windows, and if those windows are the ones described in the texts, the immediate post-birth window, the pre-linguistic communication window, the NAM formation window of early childhood, then the genes that implement the divine portion should be active specifically during those windows, and several of them are. This is not proof. The developmental expression of these genes has conventional explanations that do not require ancient genetic engineering. But it is alignment. The Sumerian texts and the genomic data are describing the same time points, the same windows, the same critical periods, from completely different directions, using completely different vocabularies, separated by 5,000 years. The second corroboration is stranger and harder to categorize. It involves the global distribution of what researchers call transgenerational epigenetic memory, the transmission of acquired characteristics from parent to child through epigenetic rather than genetic mechanisms. We discussed epigenetics earlier in the context of trauma, the finding that childhood trauma causes epigenetic changes that can be inherited by the next generation. But the inheritance is not limited to trauma. Positive experiences also leave epigenetic marks that are transmissible. Specific skills, developed at high levels of mastery, leave epigenetic signatures. The quality of parental care, specifically, the quality of attunement and presence in the relationship between parent and child, leaves epigenetic marks on the child that then affect how that child, as a parent, relates to their own children. The me returning, in other words, has a genetic, or rather, an epigenetic mechanism. The transmission of the foundational qualities between parent and child, the wonder, the presence, the openness to source that the child carries and can return to the present parent, leaves epigenetic marks. Those marks alter, slightly, the way the next generation's developmental windows operate. A child who has been truly seen, truly received, who has experienced the genuine me returning in relationship with a present parent, carries an epigenetic signature that slightly opens the developmental windows, that slightly enhances the receptivity of the clay before it hardens. This is speculative. The direct research on this specific question has not been conducted, but the mechanism is plausible, the pieces are present, and the prediction it makes is a testable one. Children of truly present, genuinely attentive parents should show, in their own parenting, measurable differences in the quality of attunement that go beyond what social learning alone would explain. This has not been formally studied, but anecdotal evidence and the indirect findings of attachment research are consistent with it. The Sumerians described this as the me being carried forward through the quality of the parental relationship, not just the content of what is transmitted, but the quality of the transmission, which itself shapes the next generation's capacity to transmit. The chain of transmission carries not only information, but the quality of the connection. And the quality of the connection is heritable, in some sense, whether genetically, epigenetically, or through the developmental experience of the child who was truly received. The third corroboration is cultural, rather than biological, and it is the most widespread. It involves the near-universal appearance, across human cultures with no obvious contact, of the same set of beliefs about children that we find in the Sumerian texts. The extended dependency of the human infant as cosmologically significant, the special perceptual capacity of young children. The critical importance of early relational experience for the formation of the person, the necessity of some form of initiation at the threshold of adulthood, the reciprocal relationship between parent and child in which both are changed by the encounter. These are not features of Sumerian culture alone. They appear in ancient Egypt, in the Vedic traditions of India, in the shamanistic traditions of Siberia and the Americas, in the indigenous cultures of Africa and Australia, in the mystery traditions of Greece and Rome. They appear in the specific vocabulary of attachment and initiation, and the extended developmental period. They appear in strikingly similar warnings about what goes wrong when these conditions are violated. The mainstream explanation for this cross-cultural consistency is diffusion. Ideas spread from one culture to another through trade, migration, and cultural contact. This explanation accounts for some of the similarities. But the distribution is too wide, the cultures too isolated from each other at the relevant time periods, for diffusion to account for all of it. The alternative explanation, which the ancient astronaut tradition embraces and which we will not dismiss, is that these similarities reflect a common origin. That the knowledge about child development embedded in the Sumerian texts, and their parallels across dozens of other ancient traditions, is not independently discovered wisdom. It is inherited wisdom. It was given to multiple human cultures at or around the same time, by the same source, the Anunnaki or their equivalents in other traditions. The giving of the me was not, in this view, limited to Sumer. The same information packages, the same maintenance protocol for the design system, were given to multiple cultures, in the vocabularies and mythological frameworks appropriate to each culture. The Sumerians received it in the form of the Anunnaki origin story, the temple system, the cuneiform tablets. The Egyptians received it in the form of Ma'at and the Neter and the temple mysteries. The Vedic cultures received it in the form of the Dharma and the Atman, and the elaborate system of developmental stages described in the Upanishads. The indigenous cultures of the Americas received it in the form of their great-grandfather traditions, their initiation practices, their cosmological frameworks for understanding the relationship between the child and the cosmos. Different packages, same information, and the same warning. The same warning appears in all of them. Do not break the circle. Do not abandon the children. Do not deprive them of play. Do not rush the formation. Do not skip the initiation. Do not fail to see. Do not fail to receive what the child is transmitting back. The warning was given many times in many forms to many cultures. And most of those cultures have broken the circle anyway. Not because they are evil, not because they are stupid, not because they did not care about their children, but because the pressures of the short term, the demands of survival, the seductions of efficiency, the disruptions of warfare and displacement and technological change consistently outweigh the long-term cost of getting child development wrong. The cost is invisible in the short term. A generation raised under degraded developmental conditions does not immediately collapse. It functions, it builds, it maintains. But something in it is missing that will become visible in the next generation, and more visible in the generation after that, and finally catastrophic in the generation after that. The Sumerians saw this trajectory playing out in their own civilization. They described it. And then their civilization ended in a way that archaeologists still puzzle over, in a collapse that was faster and more complete than the material preconditions should have predicted. The collapse of the Third Dynasty of around 2000 BCE, is one of the most studied events in ancient history. The factors involved are clear: invasion by the Amorites and Elamites, the disruption of trade networks, a period of climate change that affected agricultural productivity. These are real causes. But historians of the period note that the collapse was far more rapid and far more complete than comparable pressures should have produced in a civilization of Sumer's sophistication and scale. Something had been weakening from the inside. Something that the external pressures could exploit more effectively than they should have been able to. The Sumerian scribes, in their final period, seemed to know what it was. The lamentations over the destruction of some of the most beautiful and heartbreaking literature of the ancient world, contain, embedded within the grief for the physical destruction of the city, a grief for something more abstract. A grief for the quality of the connection between people that had once been there and was already fading before the physical collapse. A grief for the children who were already being born into conditions that were not right. A grief for the circle already breaking. The lamentation over the destruction of reads, in one of its most striking passages, "The mother did not look for her child. The father did not call for his son. The wife did not call for her husband. The mother did not look for her child." In the chaos of the physical destruction, yes. But also, the scribes understood this, even if they did not say it explicitly, in the years before the physical destruction, in the gradual erosion of the quality of presence and attention that had once characterized Sumerian family life at its best. The not looking had begun before the collapse. The collapse completed what the not looking had started. We are in the years before the collapse. We are in the period when the not looking has already begun, when the mother is not looking for her child because her phone is in her hand, because her anxiety is consuming her attention, because the economic structure of her life demands that she be in two places at once, and she cannot be fully present in either. We are in the period when the father is not calling for his son because he does not know what to say, because the words that would carry the me have not been spoken to him, and so he does not have them to give, because the chain of transmission was already breaking in his own childhood. We are in the years before the collapse. And the maintenance protocol, the 8 things, is still available. It is still written in the clay. It is still legible, still translatable, still applicable. The me have not been entirely lost. They are diminished, they are fragmentary, they are being carried by far fewer people than they once were. But they are there. The chain has not yet broken completely. The question is whether enough people, reading or hearing the warning, will act on it in time to prevent the break from becoming irreversible. The Sumerians could not answer that question. They could only write the warning and trust it to the clay. We cannot answer it either. We can only carry the warning forward. But we should be clear about what carrying the warning forward means. It does not mean returning to ancient Sumer. It does not mean abandoning the genuine achievements of modernity, the medicine, the science, the expanded moral circle, the reduction in violence, the increase in material comfort. It does not mean romanticizing a past that had its own forms of brutality and injustice. It means something more targeted and more personal. It means restoring, in the specific developmental conditions of the children currently alive in our culture, the things that the Sumerian texts identified as structurally necessary. The play-rich early years. The web of knowing faces. The genuine presence of the parent who sees and is changed by what they see. The honest acknowledgement of the child's wider perception. The eventual genuine initiation. The circle maintained. These things can be done within modernity. They can be done in an apartment, in a city, by a parent who works and who carries their own wounds from their own underbuilt, invisible architecture. They require intention, they require effort, they require being willing to be present in a culture that is systematically designed to prevent presence, but they can be done. And each one that is done, each circle that is maintained, each child who is truly seen, each divine portion that is activated rather than fading, each one adds one more link to the chain, one more generation in whom the me are carried forward, one more person who will look at their own child with the migra, the true seeing, and receive the abzu in that small and extraordinary face. This is how it survives. This is how it always survived. Not through institutions, not through laws, through people, through parents, through the most private and most consequential relationship in human experience, conducted in the ordinary, unremarkable dailiness of the household, in the 10,000 small moments that accumulate into the invisible architecture. Enki built his wisdom in the Abzu, beneath the deep waters, invisible to the surface world. The Sumerians transmitted their deepest knowledge in clay, the most ordinary and most durable of materials. The divine portion was hidden in the most unlikely of vessels, the helpless, dependent, extraordinarily needy human infant. Everything essential is hidden in what appears most ordinary. Everything important happens in what looks like nothing. The mother looking at her child, the father calling his son's name, the parent, tired and distracted and afraid, choosing to put the distraction down and actually see. That is where the Abzu is. That is where the me are transmitted. That is where the chain holds. That is the 5,000-year-old secret, hidden in the ruins of the world's first city, and it was always intended for you. Before we bring this investigation to its close, there is one dimension of the Sumerian child question that we have circled around but not yet entered directly. It is the most controversial dimension, the one most associated with the ancient astronaut tradition, and the one that requires the most careful handling. It is the question of bloodlines. The Sumerian texts are not, by any means, egalitarian in their cosmological anthropology. They do not say that all human beings carry the divine portion equally, or that the me were given to all human lineages with identical weight. They say something more specific and more uncomfortable, and, depending on how it is interpreted, more consequential. They say that certain lineages carry more of the divine portion than others, that certain human bloodlines, as a result of more direct and more recent interaction with the Anunnaki, carry the divine inheritance at a higher concentration, with greater activation, with more of the higher me intact, and that these lineages have a specific function in the maintenance of the broader human project. In the mainstream scholarly reading, this is simply the ideological infrastructure of Sumerian kingship. The divine right of kings, the claim that rulers are more directly connected to the gods than ordinary people, is the oldest and most widespread form of political legitimacy in human history. The Sumerians institutionalized this in the concept of the divine king, the ruler who is descended from, or specially chosen by, or in some cases literally fathered by the Anunnaki, and who therefore carries the divine mandate for rulership. This reading is historically accurate. But the ancient astronaut tradition asks whether the ideology of divine kingship is built on top of something real, whether the claim that certain lineages carry more of the divine portion is not merely a political fiction but a biological reality, built on actual genetic difference introduced through actual hybridization events. The texts are specific about these hybridization events. The Sumerian king list distinguishes explicitly between kings who ruled before the flood, figures of extraordinary longevity, some reigning for thousands of years, and kings who ruled after the flood, who have dramatically shorter lifespans. The pre-flood kings are, in the Sumerian framework, much more directly Anunnaki connected. Their extraordinary longevity is attributed to their closer genetic relationship with the gods. After the flood, after the great dilution of the divine bloodlines, the lifespans shortened dramatically. The pure Anunnaki inheritance becomes rarer. The divine portion in the general population is, in the Sumerian account, substantially reduced from its pre-flood level. What remains is distributed unevenly across the population, concentrated in certain lineages, present but diluted in others, barely detectable in many. The implication for child development is this. Children born into lineages with higher concentrations of the divine portion require, if anything, more careful developmental conditions than children born into lineages with less. Because the higher the concentration, the more sensitive the developmental windows, the more the capacity for the higher me, and the more devastating the consequences of those windows being violated. This is the double-edged nature of the divine inheritance. It is not simply an advantage. It is also a vulnerability. The same neurological complexity that enables the higher me also makes the developing brain more sensitive to disruption. The same extended developmental window that enables the accumulation of cultural wisdom also extends the period of exposure to developmental damage. The same dependence on relationship and attunement that makes genuine human wisdom possible also makes the human child uniquely vulnerable to the relational failures, the not seeing, the three poisons, the breaking of the circle that can derail the divine portion before it activates. High potential and high vulnerability are two faces of the same design. This is not an accident. The Sumerians understood it. Enki understood it when he built it in. The higher the ceiling, the deeper the floor can fall. This has implications that we should sit with carefully. If the divine portion is not equally distributed, if some lineages carry it at higher concentration, and if that higher concentration is associated with both higher potential and higher vulnerability, then the current global epidemic of developmental disruption is not randomly distributed in its effects. Its most damaging effects fall most heavily on the lineages that were designed to carry the me forward, the lineages most sensitive to disruption, most dependent on the right developmental conditions for their potential to activate. This is a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. It is uncomfortable for different reasons to different audiences. Some will find it uncomfortable because it implies a hierarchy of human genetic endowment, which conflicts with deeply held egalitarian values. Others will find it uncomfortable because it suggests that the groups most associated, in the ancient astronaut tradition, with bloodline purity, the royal and priestly lineages of the ancient world, were not merely self-serving elites, but the custodians of a genetic inheritance that served a purpose larger than their own power. We are not going to resolve these tensions tonight. We are not equipped to. The evidence is too fragmentary, the implications too large, the political stakes too high for a responsible resolution in a single investigation. What we can do is hold the question open and examine what the Sumerian texts actually say about the responsibility that comes with the bloodline. Because the Sumerian texts are clear that the bloodline is not primarily a privilege, it is primarily a responsibility. The divine king was not simply entitled to rule because of his divine origin. He was obligated to serve the larger project, to maintain the me, to keep the communication between the Anunnaki and the human community functional, to ensure that the developmental conditions for the population under his care were as close to optimal as he could make them. The king who failed these obligations was not merely a bad ruler in the political sense. He was a cosmic failure, a failure of the project itself, a betrayal of Enki's design. The Sumerian law codes, the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest written legal codes in the world, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries, are saturated with provisions that protect the most vulnerable children: orphans, children of widows, children of the poor. Not because of abstract humanitarian sentiment alone, but because the texts make clear that the conditions of the most vulnerable children are a direct measure of the health of the me transmission across the society. When the most vulnerable children are unprotected, the me are leaking, the chain is weakening, the project is at risk. Ur-Nammu explicitly states, in the preamble to his law code, that the purpose of these laws is to ensure that the orphan is not delivered to the rich man and that the widow is not delivered to the powerful man. These provisions are not incidental. They are central. They reflect a cosmological understanding that the well-being of the most vulnerable child is not a peripheral concern but the central measure of civilizational health. This is still true. It is more true than ever. The condition of the most vulnerable children in any society is the direct measure of whether the me are being maintained, whether the circle is holding, whether the chain is intact. The statistics on child poverty, on childhood trauma, on the developmental outcomes of children in the most disrupted environments are not merely social justice concerns. They are, in the Sumerian framework, the most important metrics we have for assessing the health of the human project. And those metrics, in the contemporary world, are alarming. Approximately 333 million children live in extreme poverty worldwide. 1 in 5 children in the United States, one of the richest nations in human history, experiences food insecurity. The rates of childhood trauma, as measured by ACE scores, show that more than half of all adults in the United States experienced at least one category of adverse childhood experience. More than a quarter experienced 3 or more. These numbers are not abstractions. Each one represents a child whose developmental windows were compromised, whose invisible architecture was built under conditions of chronic stress, whose NAM was formed in the wrong season and in the wrong way. Each one represents a link in the chain that was weakened. The accumulation of these weakened links across generations is what the Sumerian scribes were warning about when they wrote about the generation that has returned to the clay. Not the catastrophic failure of a single generation, but the gradual accumulation of compromise across many generations, each one slightly less capable of maintaining the me than the one before, each one slightly more clay and slightly less divine portion, until the civilization is maintaining its form, but has lost its content. The form remains, the cities remain, the technologies become more elaborate, the institutions persist. But the quality of connection, the quality of presence, the quality of the seeing that sustains the me returning, that gradually fades. And the fading is so gradual, so normalized, so thoroughly embedded in the ordinary texture of daily life that it becomes invisible. We do not see it as loss. We see it as the way things are. The way things are, 4 words that have entombed more lost knowledge than any flood or invasion or conquest in the history of civilization. The Sumerians were trying to prevent those 4 words from being the endpoint of their civilization's wisdom. They were trying to ensure that the knowledge did not sink into the sediment of the ordinary, that it retained its charge, its urgency, its capacity to change the behavior of whoever encountered it. They wrote it in clay. The clay lasted. Whether the knowledge can be recovered, whether it still has the power to change something, now, in the world we currently inhabit, is the question this investigation has been circling. And the answer is the same as the answer to every question about civilization and its maintenance. It begins with one person who reads the warning and understands it. One person who looks at their child and chooses to actually see. One person in whom the chain holds. One person who carries the me forward. One more link that does not break. That is how the Abzu is maintained. Not by empires, not by institutions, by individuals. By the mother who looks for her child. By the father who calls his son's name. By the parent who is tired and afraid and confused and who, in the middle of all of that, chooses to put it down and see. You are that person. You are the one who is holding this chain at this moment, at this point in history, in this specific set of circumstances. The Sumerians wrote their warning for you. Enki looked into the face of his creation and was changed, and the change was carried forward through everything that followed. And it arrived here, at this moment, in this specific encounter between the 5,000-year-old words in clay and the living mind that is now receiving them. What you do with this encounter is the question. What the Sumerians said about children, all 8 things, points toward the same answer. The answer is, be present, see the child, maintain the circle, hold the chain. Trust that what was given to us at the beginning, the divine portion, the me, the extraordinary, vulnerable, designed intelligence of the human child, trust that it was given for a reason, and act accordingly. Everything else follows from this. All the developmental wisdom, all the parenting knowledge, all the understanding of the windows and the seasons and the poisons and the initiation, all of it is in service of this one thing. Be present, see, receive, transmit. The kingship descended from heaven and was placed in Eridu. What was placed there was not merely power, it was responsibility. The responsibility to see the child, to maintain the circle, to keep the me alive, and transmit them forward. That responsibility has not lapsed. It is still in force. It is still in your hands. It was always in the hands of whoever was present, whoever was seeing, whoever was willing to be changed by what they found in the face of the child looking back at them. That has always been the maintenance protocol. It will always be the maintenance protocol. It is written in the deepest architecture of the human developmental system, inscribed there by whoever designed it for the duration of the project, for as long as children are born and parents look into their faces, and the circle either holds or breaks. Hold the circle. That is the one thing. That is what was written in clay. There are Sumerian tablets that nobody talks about in the popular literature. Not because they are inaccessible, they have been translated and published, they sit in academic databases and museum archives, but because they are inconvenient. They do not fit the established narratives about ancient Mesopotamia, and they do not fit the popular narratives about the ancient astronaut tradition either. They occupy an uncomfortable middle ground where the evidence points somewhere that everyone is reluctant to go. These are the tablets dealing with what the Sumerians called the Ur-Nama, the original child conditions. The conditions that existed, the texts say, in the earliest period of the Anunnaki-human interface, before the flood, before the great reduction in divine bloodline concentration, before the civilizational disruptions that began the long erosion we have been tracing. The Ur-Nama texts describe a period that is deeply strange from a modern perspective, a period in which the developmental conditions for human children were, by the Sumerian account, radically different from anything that exists today. A period in which the three poisons were apparently absent, not because they had been suppressed or prohibited, but because the conditions that produced them had not yet emerged. A period in which the me returning flowed freely in both directions because the quality of adult presence was, apparently, of a different order than what has been available since. What made it different? The texts are not entirely clear, but they point consistently toward one variable: the Anunnaki were present. Not merely present in the cosmological sense, not merely accessible through prayer and ritual, physically present, or something that functions equivalently to physical presence in the context of the developmental system we have been discussing. And the Anunnaki presence, whatever its precise nature, had a specific effect on the developmental conditions for human children. The presence, the texts say, maintained a quality of what we might call ambient attunement, a field, a frequency, a pervasive quality of being seen that saturated the environment in which children developed. Children growing up in this field did not depend exclusively on their individual parents for the true seeing, the migra. The field itself provided a version of it. The divine gaze was present in the environment, not only in the specific relationship between a given parent and a given child. This is, on its face, an extraordinary claim. But it is also, interestingly, consistent with what developmental research has found about the effects of community-level variables on child development. Children raised in communities with high levels of what researchers call social capital, trust, mutual recognition, collective attunement to the well-being of all children, show significantly better developmental outcomes than children raised in communities with low social capital, even when controlling for individual family circumstances. The community-level quality of collective seeing matters. The ambient environment of recognition and attunement matters. The child does not develop only in the specific relationship with its parent. It develops in the field created by the community's collective relationship to children. What the Sumerian texts describe as the Ur-Nama conditions may be, in this light, a description of a radically high-quality community field. A community or a species environment, a specific period in early human history, in which the collective quality of attunement and presence was so elevated that the developmental conditions for the divine portion were, for a period, optimal. During which the me were flowing freely, the invisible architecture was being properly built, the higher me were activating regularly across the population. And then this period ended. The texts are unclear about exactly why. The flood narrative is the most prominent explanation. But other texts suggest that the erosion was already underway before the flood, that the flood was as much a symptom as a cause. The Anunnaki presence reduced. The ambient field weakened. The burden of the true seeing fell more exclusively on individual parents. And individual parents, without the field supporting them, without the ambient attunement maintaining the community's collective relationship to children, began, gradually, unevenly, not deliberately but inevitably, to fail. The post-flood period, in the Ur-Nama texts, is described with a wistfulness that is one of the most affecting things in the entire Sumerian corpus. It is the wistfulness of people who know, from their tradition, that something was once present that is now absent, who carry the memory of a quality of experience that they cannot quite recreate, cannot quite access, but cannot quite forget either. This is a recognizable human experience. It is the experience of people in every tradition that has a memory of a golden age, a time before the fall, a time before the forgetting, a time when the connection between the human and the divine was direct and constant and ordinary rather than rare and effortful and uncertain. Every great religious and mythological tradition has some vantargen of this memory. The Garden of Eden, the Sat Yuga, the Age of Kronos, the dream time of the Australian indigenous peoples, when the ancestors were present and the world was alive with meaning. The Ur-Nama texts are Sumer's version. And they describe this lost quality not in terms of physical paradise or material abundance, but in terms of the quality of the developmental experience, specifically, the quality of the experience of being a child, of being seen, of having the divine portion recognized and cultivated, of growing up in a field of ambient attunement that made the full activation of the me not a heroic individual achievement, but a normal developmental outcome. The tablets describe the transition from this state to the post-flood world, with a metaphor that is striking. It is as if they say, the sun moved further away. Not much, not so far that life became impossible, but far enough that things began to need more effort to grow, far enough that the crops required irrigation that the rain alone had previously provided, far enough that the darkness was a little darker, and the cold a little colder, and the children needed more from their parents because the ambient warmth that had previously supplemented the parental provision was no longer as strong. The sun moved further away. In the cosmological framework of the ancient astronaut tradition, this is understood literally. The Anunnaki withdrew. The field they maintained attenuated. The ambient quality of the environment in which human children developed shifted downward. The developmental conditions became harder. The circle became more fragile. The chain became more vulnerable to breaking. In the developmental science framework, the same metaphor describes something real without requiring any ancient spacecraft or genetic engineering. The quality of the community's collective relationship to children, the social capital, the ambient attunement, has been declining in the industrialized world for roughly 2 centuries, and the developmental consequences of that decline are now visible in the epidemiological data. Both readings point to the same practical implication. The ambient field is weaker than it used to be. The individual parent is carrying more of the burden than the developmental system was designed to support. And the response to this, the Sumerian response, the response embedded in the Ur-Nama texts, is not despair. It is compensation. Conscious, intentional, effort-requiring compensation. Where the ambient field has weakened, the individual must strengthen. Where the community's collective seeing has diminished, the individual parent must see more deliberately. Where the environmental support for the child's developmental windows has reduced, the conscious cultivation of those windows must increase. This is harder than living in the Ur-Nama conditions. It requires more of people who are already stretched. It requires a quality of attention and presence that a culture designed for distraction actively undermines. It requires the willingness to swim against the current, not dramatically, not with heroic sacrifice, but in the small, daily, unglamorous way of simply being more present than the culture is asking you to be. The Sumerian scribes who preserved the Ur-Nama texts understood this. They were not nostalgic in the passive sense, not simply mourning a lost golden age. They were strategic. They were preserving the knowledge of what the conditions had once been, so that individuals living in diminished conditions would know what they were trying to recreate, would know what optimal looked like, would have a target. The target is the Ur-Nama conditions. Not literally, not the physical world of ancient Sumer or the Anunnaki presence in whatever form it took, but the quality it represents, the ambient field of true seeing, the community's collective investment in the developmental conditions of its children, the ordinary, unremarkable, taken-for-granted quality of the early developmental experience that made full activation of the divine portion a normal outcome rather than a remarkable exception. This target is not unreachable from where we are. It is reachable. It requires coordination. It requires the accumulation of individual choices, individual parents choosing to see, individual communities choosing to invest in their children, individual institutions choosing to structure themselves around developmental needs rather than economic convenience. It requires the accumulation of these choices across enough people, sustained over enough time, to begin to rebuild the ambient field. It begins with one person seeing one child, but it does not end there. The parent who truly sees their child becomes, through the me returning, a parent who is more fully themselves, more present, more grounded, more able to see others as well as their child. The child who is truly seen becomes, through the proper building of the invisible architecture, a person who will see their own children. The circle maintained in one household creates a quality of seeing that radiates outward into the web of relationships around that household. The field, weakened but not extinct, can be rebuilt one circle at a time. This is the Ur-Nama aspiration. Not a return to a literal past, but a reconstruction of the quality of attention and presence that characterize the best conditions for human development. The reconstruction of a world in which children grow up seen and held and played and initiated and return to their parents who are themselves renewed by the seeing. A world in which the me flow freely in both directions, and the chain holds and the divine portion activates, and the project continues. The tablets nobody talks about contain, in the end, the same message as all the tablets we have been discussing. The message encoded in the 8 things, the message written in the clay, the message that has been waiting 5,000 years for someone to receive it with full understanding. It is this: you are not too late. The chain is not broken completely. The divine portion has not been lost. The conditions can be restored, the circle can be held, the me can be transmitted forward, but it requires seeing, it It requires being present. It requires the willingness to look into the face of a child and find there, in that small and extraordinary face, the Abzu, the deep waters, the primordial source, the thing that was present before the sun moved further away and will be present long after everything built by human hands has returned to the ground it was raised from. That is what is in the tablets nobody talks about. That is what was always in the tablets. That is what was always in the child's face. And now that we have gone this far together, now that we have traced the 8 things from the ruins of Eridu through the genetics and the neuroscience and the archaeology and the forbidden history, now we need to look at what all of this means for the present moment. Because the present moment is where it has always had to arrive. The past is only useful insofar as it illuminates the present. The Anunnaki wrote the instructions for their created beings, and we are those beings, and the present moment is when the instructions are either acted on or ignored. We are in that moment now. Let us talk about what is actually happening right now. Not 5,000 years ago, not in the archives of the British Museum, not in the translated fragments of tablets that have been sitting in drawers since the 19th century. What is happening right now, in the world where real children are growing up, and what it looks like through the lens of everything we have discussed? The first thing to say is that the data is not ambiguous. We are living through a historically unprecedented deterioration in the mental health of children and adolescents in the industrialized world. The numbers have been climbing since at least the 1990s, with the most dramatic increases occurring in the decade since the widespread adoption of smartphones and social media. But the roots of the deterioration go back further than the smartphone. They go back to the structural changes in family and community life that preceded it. The United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that emergency room visits for self-harm among girls aged 10 to 14 have more than doubled since 2011. Among older adolescents, emergency room visits for self-harm have increased by 188% since 2009. Diagnosis of anxiety disorders among children and adolescents has increased by roughly 20% per decade for the past 3 decades. Rates of loneliness among young people have reached levels that researchers describe carefully as extraordinary, not because researchers are inclined to dramatic language, but because no other word is adequate. This is not the normal variation of human well-being across generations. This is a signal, a clear, strong, consistent signal that something in the developmental conditions for children in our culture has fundamentally changed in a direction that is producing measurable harm. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at NYU who has spent the last decade examining this data, argues that 2 overlapping trends are primarily responsible. The collapse of child-directed free play beginning in the late 1980s, driven by increased parental fear, and the parallel increase in supervised structured activities, and the introduction of the smartphone and social media in the early 2010s, which replaced the diminished physical social world with a virtual social world that fails to provide what the developmental system requires. Haidt's analysis is compelling and well supported, but through the Sumerian lens, it is also incomplete. Because it focuses on the proximate causes, the smartphone, the supervised childhood, the decline of free play, without reaching the deeper cause that the Sumerian texts identify. The deeper cause is the degradation of the quality of adult presence with children. The smartphone is a powerful mechanism for degrading that presence. The overscheduled childhood is a powerful mechanism for replacing genuine relational presence with structured activity. But these are symptoms of a prior cause. The loss of the understanding that the quality of the parent's genuine seeing is the foundational developmental requirement for the human child. We have lost this understanding. We have replaced it with a theory of childhood that is, in the Sumerian terms, we have been using categorically wrong about what the child needs. We have replaced the theory of the child as a receiver of the me and a transmitter of the foundational qualities back to the parent. The understanding of the child as a participant in a sacred and necessary circle, with a theory of the child as a developing organism, whose development must be optimized through the right inputs. The optimization theory of childhood treats the parent as a manager. The manager's job is to provide the right stimulation, the right nutrition, the right educational experiences, the right social opportunities, the right therapeutic interventions when things go wrong. The manager monitors, assesses, adjusts, and intervenes. The child is the project under management. This theory is not wrong in every respect. Children do need certain inputs. Nutrition matters. Education matters. Social opportunities matter. Therapeutic intervention for genuine problems matters. But the optimization theory is catastrophically incomplete because it fails to account for the one variable that the Sumerian texts, the attachment research, the developmental neuroscience, and the epidemiological data all converge on, as the most important. The quality of the parent's genuine presence. The willingness to see, to receive, to be changed by what is found in the face of the child. You cannot optimize your way to genuine presence. You cannot manage your way to it. It is not a technique. It is a state of being. And the state of being required for genuine seeing, the undefended, unagenda-ed, genuinely curious receptivity to the actual child in front of you, is precisely the state of being that the optimization theory most consistently disrupts. Because optimizing requires an agenda. It requires having a model of what the child should be and measuring the child against it. And a parent who is constantly measuring the child against a model cannot see the actual child that is standing in front of them. The Sumerians called this failure the fourth poison. It does not have a specific name in the texts. It is not listed alongside the three we examined earlier. But it is implied throughout. The parent who is so focused on what the child should become that they cannot see what the child is. And what the child is, in its actuality, in its specificity, in the divine portion that it carries and that is waiting to be recognized, is not a deficiency to be corrected. It is not a developmental task to be managed. It is not a potential to be optimized. It is a transmission, a communication from the source, a living signal from the Abzu, waiting for a parent who is tuned to receive it. The smartphone is not the enemy. The helicopter parent is not the enemy. The overscheduled child is not the enemy. These are all expressions of a single underlying failure, the loss of the understanding of what the child is, and therefore the loss of the capacity to relate to the child as what it actually is. Restoring that understanding is the work. Not the work of parenting better in the technique and optimization sense. The work of understanding differently, at a fundamental level, understanding the child differently. Understanding the relationship between parent and child differently. Understanding what is at stake differently. What is at stake, in the Sumerian framework, is not the child's future achievement or well-being in the narrow individual sense. What is at stake is the activation of the divine portion, the maintenance of the me, the holding of the chain, the preservation of what was given in the beginning for a purpose that extends beyond any individual lifetime and any individual family. When parents understand this, when they understand that their child is not primarily a project or a future adult in training, but a current carrier of the divine inheritance, a transmitter of the foundational qualities, a link in a chain that goes back to the first city and forward to whatever the human project is building toward. When parents understand this, the relationship changes. Not at the level of technique, at the level of orientation. The oriented parent is not a better manager. The oriented parent is no longer a manager. The oriented parent is a participant in something sacred, in the same sense that Enki was a participant in something sacred when he looked into the face of his creation and was changed. The parent is not doing something to the child. The parent is in a circle with the child, and the circle is the thing. The circle is the point. The circle is what was set in motion in Eridu, and what must be maintained if the project is to continue. How does a parent who has absorbed this understanding actually behave differently? What does it look like in practice? It looks quiet. It looks unremarkable. It looks like putting the phone down. It looks like sitting on the floor. It looks like following the child's attention rather than directing it. It looks like being genuinely curious about what the child is doing and why, in the same way that you would be curious about someone you love and find fascinating. It looks like allowing yourself to be moved by the child, to be surprised, to be delighted, to be confused, to be challenged, to have your certainties gently dissolved by the child's unfiltered encounter with reality. It looks like what parents in the Ur-Nama texts were apparently doing naturally, in the ambient field that supported that quality of attention. It looks like what individual parents in every tradition manage to do when they are sufficiently present, sufficiently grounded, sufficiently unencumbered by the noise and demand and distraction of the cultural environment. It is harder now than it was in the Ur-Nama conditions. It is harder because the ambient field is weaker. It is harder because the culture is actively working against this quality of attention. It is harder because the parent's own invisible architecture may be incomplete, because the parent was not truly seen as a child, and the me returning that should have renewed the parent's connection to source did not fully happen. But it is possible. And when it happens, when a parent succeeds in genuinely seeing a child, when the true seeing lands and the me returning flows and the circle completes, the effect is not limited to that parent and that child. It ripples. The parent who has been changed by the true seeing relates differently to other people, not just to the child. The child who has been truly seen relates differently to other people, not just to the parent. The quality of presence, once touched, tends to spread. The circle, once maintained, creates an attractive field that other circles can form around. This is how the ambient field is rebuilt. Not by decree, not by institution, not by policy or program or cultural movement, by circles. One at a time, in the ordinary, unremarkable dailiness of families and households, spreading outward through the quality of presence that genuine seeing creates. The Sumerians knew this. They knew that the grand project, the maintenance of the me, the activation of the divine portion across the population, depended ultimately on the smallest and most private act, the parent's genuine seeing of the child. They knew that you cannot scale this. You cannot bureaucratize it. You cannot manufacture it. You can only create the conditions in which it is more likely to happen, and then trust that the human impulse toward genuine connection, the impulse toward the circle, will do the rest. They encoded this trust in the 8 things. They encoded it in the warning and in the prescription and in the image of the Abzu in the face of the child. They encoded it in the migra, the true seeing, and in the kitag, the touching of ground. They encoded it in the urnama aspiration, the goal of recreating, in every individual household, something of the quality that was present at the beginning. And they sent it forward in time, not to any specific person, not to any specific generation, to whoever was present enough to receive it. Here is what they sent. The child is not a project. The child is a circle. Enter the circle. Be changed by what you find there. And then send that change forward, in the quality of your attention, in the fullness of your presence, in your willingness to hold the chain, into the next generation and the generation after that. For as long as the me endure, and the divine portion is transmitted, and the project that was set in motion in Eridu continues toward wherever it was always going. That is the Sumerian message about children. All of it. All 8 things, and the context that surrounds them, and the cosmology that grounds them, and the warning that animates them. That is what was written in clay. That is what was waiting for us. Now let us go even deeper. Let us look at what happens in the specific moments, the ordinary, intimate, private moments, when the migra is actually occurring. When the parent is genuinely seeing and the circle is genuinely turning, let us try to describe what those moments actually feel like, from the inside, and why the Sumerians considered them the most cosmologically significant events available to ordinary human experience. Because these are not exotic states. They are not spiritual achievements reserved for advanced practitioners of some tradition. They happen in living rooms. They happen at kitchen tables. They happen at 3 in the morning when a child is sick and a parent is exhausted and sits anyway, in the dark, watching the child breathe. They are the most ordinary, extraordinary events in the world. And they have been happening in human households since the first house was built. And each one, the Sumerians said, is a repetition of the first, Enki looking into the face of his creation and being changed. The universe knowing itself through the meeting of the parent's seeing and the child's being. Let us look at what that meeting actually is. The moments of true seeing do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with ceremony or with forewarning. They happen in the middle of things, in the middle of the ordinary business of the day, the ordinary fatigue of parenthood, the ordinary distraction of the adult mind that is always partly elsewhere. They happen when the child does something unexpected, says something unexpected, is, suddenly and vividly, more itself than you have been paying attention to. And you look up, or you look down, if the child is small, and you see it. Not the child you expect, not the child you are worried about or proud of or hoping for. The actual child. The specific, unrepeatable, carrying the divine portion child that is standing in front of you right now, looking back at you with the ancient eyes of a being that was designed from the beginning to be seen. The Sumerian texts describe this moment with a precision that is startling. They describe the physiological response, the breath that catches, the quality of attention that suddenly sharpens, the sensation that the ordinary room has become, for this moment, something other than ordinary. They describe the cognitive response, the sudden suspension of the parent's usual internal monologue, the quiet that falls over the mind's habitual business, the sense of a larger space opening up inside the moment. And they describe what they call the te, the touching, a term from the technical vocabulary of Sumerian cosmology that refers to the moment when 2 things that are of different orders come into contact. The moment when the human touches the divine. The moment when the created encounters the creator. The te. What is the te in the context of the parent-child encounter? It is the moment when the parent's consciousness, adult consciousness, socialized consciousness, the consciousness that has been shaped by decades of human experience and human limitation, touches the child's consciousness. Not ordinary child consciousness, not the surface level of the child's personality and behavior and developmental stage. The deeper thing, the divine portion. The part that has not yet been fully shaped by experience, that is still carrying the freshness of origin. The te happens when those 2 levels of consciousness meet. When the adult's accumulated, experienced, limited, wounded, shaped consciousness encounters the child's original, fresh, carrying the source consciousness. And in the moment of encounter, something passes in both directions simultaneously. To the child, from the parent, recognition. The recognition that is the most fundamental developmental need, the experience of being truly seen by a consciousness that can reflect back, with the full weight of adult awareness, that the child exists, matters, is specific and real and valuable. This recognition is not praise. It is not approval. It is not evaluation. It is simpler and more powerful than any of those things. It is the simple fact of the parent's genuine seeing, which communicates to the child's developing consciousness. You are real. I see you. You exist. To the parent, from the child, renewal, the me returning, the touching of ground, the brief, clarifying, sometimes overwhelming experience of contact with the source, the Abzu, that the child's divine portion carries and transmits in the moment of genuine seeing. These two movements happen simultaneously. They are not sequential. The recognition flows to the child, and the renewal flows to the parent at the same instant, in the same act of genuine seeing. This is why the Sumerians called it a circle, because the energy flows in both directions at once, and the circle is sustained by the simultaneous giving and receiving. What does this feel like from the inside? For the parent who has experienced it, the description will ring true. For the parent who has not yet experienced it, or who has experienced it without having the vocabulary to name what happened, the description may open a door. It feels like the world becoming more real. A sudden increase in the density of the present moment. A sense that this moment, this specific configuration of you and this child in this room at this time, is not a moment passing through on its way to somewhere else, but a moment that is itself the destination. That this is where things actually are. That all the past that led here and all the future that will come from here are less real than this. This child's face, this quality of attention, this breath. It feels like recognizing something that you knew before you knew it. Not déjà vu in the usual sense, something deeper. The recognition of a quality of reality that you encountered, fully, as a child yourself, when you were the one being truly seen, if you were fortunate enough to have that experience, and that you have been seeking, at some level, in every significant relationship of your adult life. It feels like the question becoming the answer. All the things you were worried about, the child's development, your own adequacy as a parent, the future, the world, those things do not disappear. But they become, in this moment, less urgent than the simple fact of the child in front of you. The simplicity is overwhelming. After all the complexity, this is what it comes down to: a child, and the quality of your seeing. And it feels, the Sumerians said, like touching the ground. The key tag. The return to the foundational reality beneath all the overlay, beneath the anxiety and the ambition and the fear and the hope and the accumulated weight of being a person in the world. Beneath all of that, there is something that does not change. Something that was there before the overlay began and will be there after it is gone. The child's presence, in the moment of true seeing, touches that something in the parent. Reminds the parent that it is there. This is what Shulgi was describing when he wrote about seeing the Abzu in his child's face. Not a mystical vision, not a hallucination, a recognition. The recognition of something that was always present, but that required the child's unfiltered being to make visible. The irony of adult experience is this: we become, through the process of developing into adults, progressively less able to perceive the foundational reality that was most immediately available to us as children. We build the overlay, the concepts, the categories, the expectations, the habits of mind that make adult functioning possible, and in building it, we cover over the immediate experience of reality that the child has before the overlay is installed. The child's unmediated access to the present moment, to the sensory richness of experience, to the simple fact of being alive in a specific body in a specific place. This is what the child carries. And this is what gets progressively covered over as the child becomes an adult. The parent in the moment of true seeing recovers, briefly, something of this access, not through some mystical practice, through the contact with the child who still has it, through the me returning, through the circle. This is why the Sumerians considered the parent-child relationship, genuinely entered, genuinely maintained, to be a developmental path in itself, not a preparation for something else, not a stage on the way to something more important. The relationship itself is the path. The quality of seeing that it cultivates, the groundedness that the me returning provides, the regular touching of the foundational reality through the child's unfiltered presence, this is among the highest developmental opportunities available to a human being. Not despite the difficulty, Not in spite of the exhaustion and the frustration and the fear and the overwhelming nature of the responsibility. Through all of that, because all of that is part of the path. The difficulty of parenthood is not incidental to its developmental function. It is the curriculum. The demand of genuine care, the requirement to show up consistently, to be present when you would rather not be, to give what you have even when you feel empty. This demand is precisely what creates the conditions for the TE to occur. The parent who is present not because it is easy, but because they have chosen to be present anyway, that parent is in the position from which the true seeing is most likely to happen. The Sumerians did not romanticize parenthood. They were not sentimental about it. The texts that deal with the difficulty of the task are as honest as those that describe its gifts. The parent is exhausted. The parent is afraid. The parent makes mistakes. The parent carries their own incomplete, invisible architecture, their own unreturned me, their own uncrossed thresholds. The parent is, in many respects, still in process, still developing, still working out who they are and what they are for. And the child needs this parent. Not despite the parent's incompleteness. The child needs the specific, limited, wounded, seeking parent that is actually there. Because this parent, this imperfect, searching, doing their best parent, is the one that the child's development is calibrated to receive from. Not a perfect sage. Not an enlightened master. A parent. A human parent with human limitations and human love, willing to show up and be present and do the work of seeing, even when seeing is hard. This is what the chain of transmission requires. Not perfection. Presence. Of the willingness to show up in the relationship, even carrying your own wounds, and do the best seeing you can from where you are. And in the process, be changed. Allow the me returning to do its work. Allow the child's divine portion to touch the ground in you. Allow the TE to happen. The touching of the two orders of consciousness that opens, in the adult, the access to the source that only the child can provide. This is the circle. This is what was given. This is what must be maintained. And it is maintained in exactly this way, in the ordinary, imperfect daily practice of showing up to see the actual child who is actually there. Not the child of your imagination or your fear. The child. The one who is pointing at the star and knows its name. The one who is building the mud city and learning what you cannot teach. The one who is waiting, with the patience of a being that has eternity written into its developmental architecture, for the moment when you are finally present enough to receive what it has been trying to transmit since the day it arrived. The moment is now. It is always now. The child is not waiting for a better time or a less distracted parent or a more prepared adult. The child is waiting for you, specifically, imperfectly, presently you, to look up from whatever you were doing and see. Look up. The Sumerians wrote this instruction in clay because they knew how easy it is to look down, to stay absorbed in the adult world's demands and concerns and noise. To spend an entire childhood in the same room as a child without ever truly seeing that child. To transmit the me, technically, food, shelter, education, opportunity, without transmitting the thing that the me are supposed to carry. Without the current running through the wire. Without the circle completing. They saw parents looking down even then, 5,000 years ago, even in a civilization that took child-rearing more seriously than any civilization since. They saw the distraction of politics and commerce and war and the endless demands of maintaining a city at the edge of the desert. They saw parents who were physically present, but mentally elsewhere. Parents who provided but did not see. Parents who shaped the child's destiny without knowing that they were shaping it, without choosing consciously the impression they were making in the not yet hardened clay. They wrote the warning for those parents. And for us. Look up. See the child. This is the oldest instruction there is, from the civilization that first wrote instructions down, from the God who designed us for this, from the Abzu that is waiting in every child's face for the parent who is present enough to find it. Look up. That is the instruction, that is everything. All the complexity of the 8 things, all the Anunnaki mythology, and the developmental neuroscience and the epigenetics and the archaeology and the forbidden history, it all comes down to this. Look up. See the child. Be changed. And send it forward. Let us now gather all the threads. Let us look at the full picture, not as a sequence of numbered points, not as a checklist or a theory, but as what it actually is, a coherent, integrated account of the human condition that predates every philosophy and every religion we know, that was buried under the sediment of time and the noise of history, and that is emerging again now. The Sumerians appeared in the historical record approximately 5,400 BCE at a site called Eridu, in the marshes of what is now southern Iraq, and they described themselves as the beneficiaries of knowledge and civilization that had descended from heaven. They did not present this as mythology, they presented it as history. And the knowledge they described receiving was not primarily knowledge about agriculture, or architecture, or astronomy, or mathematics, important as all of those were. The most important knowledge they described receiving was knowledge about human beings. Specifically, knowledge about how human beings develop, what they require, and what they are for. That knowledge is what we have been examining, and it is extraordinary, not because it is mystical or supernatural, but because it is specific, accurate, and verifiable. The Sumerian account of child development aligns with the findings of modern neuroscience at a level of precision that cannot be explained by lucky guessing or by the common sense that any careful observer of children would develop. It aligns at the level of mechanism, the specific mechanisms of attachment, of epigenetics, of critical developmental windows, of the serve and return interaction, mechanisms that were invisible to human observers until the 20th century, and that the Sumerians described accurately without any apparent access to the tools that would have allowed them to discover these mechanisms through observation alone. Something is going on here, something that the standard accounts of human prehistory cannot fully accommodate. Whether that something is the literal descent of technologically sophisticated beings from another world, or the emergence, in some isolated early population, of a level of understanding about human development that was so sophisticated it had to be expressed in mythological language because no other language was available, or some third possibility that we have not yet imagined. Something is going on. The 8 things are not randomly selected wisdom. They form a coherent system. Each one builds on the others. Each one addresses a specific aspect of the developmental architecture of the human child, and together they constitute a complete theory of what the child is, what the child needs, and what happens when those needs are met or violated. Thing 1. The child is a designed being. Its extraordinary vulnerability and dependency are not evolutionary accidents. They are design features, features that create the conditions for the most complex developmental trajectory in the known biological world. The divine portion is the seed of a capability that exceeds the child's starting design, that will exceed the capacity of any individual, that is aimed at something larger than any one lifetime. Thing 2. The invisible architecture. The physical structure of the developing brain, its wiring, its chemical environment, its default patterns of response and regulation, is built during a specific developmental window, primarily through the quality of the child's earliest relationships. The builder is not the child. The builder is the web of caring adults around the child, and primarily the primary caregiver, whose quality of presence determines the quality of the architecture that is built. Thing 3. The seasons of formation. The developmental windows are not evenly distributed. Some periods are more sensitive than others. Some opportunities are irreversible. The window closes, and what was not built in that window cannot be fully built later. The timing of developmental input matters as much as its quality. Thing 4. What goes wrong? The 3 poisons: chronic threat without comfort, the invalidation of the child's perception, and the failure to transmit the knowledge of the child's divine origin, each cause specific, measurable, lasting damage to the developing architecture. The accumulation of these poisons across a population produces a generation whose invisible architecture is compromised at the foundational level, a generation that can maintain the form of civilization but has lost access to its deeper content. Thing 5. The sacred work of play. Play is not the opposite of work. Play is the primary mechanism through which the child builds the neural architecture of executive function, of creative problem solving, of social cognition, and of the highest human capacities, the capacities that the Sumerians associated with the divine portion. Abbreviating the play-rich years is not an innocent trade-off. It is a direct assault on the construction of the invisible architecture. Thing 6. Initiation. The transition from child to adult requires more than biological maturation. It requires the community's explicit recognition of what the young person has become, and the explicit transfer of responsibility that makes the young person a keeper and transmitter of the me rather than a receiver. Without genuine initiation, the identity remains uncrossed, and the young person carries, into adult life, an uncompleted developmental task that can never be completed by later achievement or experience. Thing 7. What children see. The child's wider perceptual field, less filtered, less pre-sorted, more open to inputs that adult consciousness screens out, is not a developmental immaturity to be corrected. It is a capacity. The specific capacity that connects human beings to the divine portion, the capacity for non-ordinary perception, for direct encounter with the source, for the knowing that the adult's socialized consciousness has largely lost. This capacity requires acknowledgement and cultivation, not denial and suppression. Thing 8. The one thing. The child is not only a receiver, the child is a transmitter. It transmits back to the genuinely present parent the most foundational qualities of the divine portion, the qualities that the parent has lost in the process of becoming an adult. The me returning, the touching of the ground, the abzu in the face of the child. This reciprocal transmission is not a bonus. It is the mechanism through which the divine portion is renewed in each generation. When it flows, the chain holds. When it is blocked, when parents are not present enough to truly see, the chain weakens. These 8 things taken together describe a system. A system that was designed, or that evolved, depending on which account you accept, to produce human beings of extraordinary capability. Beings capable of the highest me, wisdom, creative power, the perception of the deep structure of reality, the capacity to transmit accumulated knowledge across generations in a form that grows rather than merely persisting. Beings capable of whatever it was that Enki saw in the first human face and was changed by. Beings capable of surprising even the beings who designed them. That system requires specific conditions to operate correctly. The conditions are the 8 things. And those conditions are currently being systematically undermined, at a scale and with a thoroughness that the Sumerians could not have imagined, by the specific combination of economic, technological, and cultural forces that define the contemporary industrialized world. The consequences are in the data. The mental health epidemic, the loneliness epidemic, the cognitive decline, the Flynn reversal, the erosion of the capacity for sustained attention, deep relationship, genuine empathy, the narrowing of the perceptual field, the atrophying of imagination. The loss of wonder, which the Sumerians would immediately recognize as the loss of the divine portion's freshness. The closing of the wider perceptual field, not in adolescence, as it is supposed to close, but in early childhood, before it has had time to be cultivated and integrated. These are not separate problems requiring separate solutions. They are one problem, the problem of the broken circle, the problem of the chain weakening across the generations, the problem that the Sumerian scribes saw the beginning of in the late period of their civilization and wrote their warning against. The warning has arrived. It was preserved in the clay, survived the flood and the invasions and the burial of the libraries and the centuries of excavation and the difficult work of decipherment and the dismissal of the scholars who should have paid closer attention to what they were, finding it survived all of that and arrived here. In this investigation, in this moment, in the mind of anyone who has followed this far. The question that the warning raises is not historical. It is not about what the Anunnaki intended, or what Enki designed, or what was lost in the flood. Those questions are interesting, and we have been taking them seriously throughout, because they matter for context and motivation, and the full appreciation of what is at stake. But the question the warning raises is personal, and it is this. What will you do with this? Not you in the abstract, not humanity in the general. You, the specific person who has followed this investigation to this point. You, with your specific circumstances and your specific relationship to children, whether as a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, an aunt or uncle, a neighbor, a community member, a person who was once a child and is still, in some dimension, the child you were. What will you do with this? The Sumerian texts do not give instructions for rescuing civilization. They do not contain a plan for reversing the Flynn reversal, or reducing the childhood mental health epidemic, or rebuilding the extended family network, or restoring the web of knowing faces at scale. They do not offer a political program or a social movement or a cultural reformation. They offer something simpler and more fundamental. They offer the understanding of what the foundational act is. The act that, done in one household, begins to restore the ambient field. The act that, done in enough households, can rebuild the chain. The act that, done consistently enough and consciously enough, changes the epigenetic inheritance passed from this generation to the next and makes the developmental windows of the next generation a little more open, the invisible architecture a little more soundly built, the divine portion a little more fully activated. The act is seeing, genuine seeing, the migra. Looking at the child in front of you, your child, the child of a sibling, the child of a friend, the child in your classroom or your neighborhood, looking at that child with the fullness of your attention and the willingness to be changed by what you find. This is not difficult in the sense of requiring specialized knowledge or special capability. Every parent has the capacity for it. Every human being has the capacity for it. It is built into us, by Enki, by evolution, by whatever process produced the extraordinary creature that we are. It is built into us as a potential that is activated by the encounter with the unfiltered being of the child. What makes it difficult is not the act itself. What makes it difficult is everything that interferes with it. The phone, the preoccupation, the anxiety, the agenda, the model of what the child should be, that prevents us from seeing what the child is. The wound from our own childhood in which we were not truly seen, which leaves us uncertain of how to give what we did not receive. All of these are real obstacles. They are not moral failures. They are the predictable results of a civilization that has been degrading the developmental conditions for children for long enough that the adults doing the degrading are themselves the products of degraded developmental conditions. The parents who are not present with their children were not truly seen by their own parents. The chain has been weakening for generations, and each generation is both victim and perpetuator of the weakening. This is the loop. This is what makes the problem systemic and not individual. You cannot fully blame the individual parent for what the system produces. And you cannot fully excuse the system for what the individual parent does, because the system is made of individual choices accumulated across time. The way out of the loop is through the individual choice. The individual choice to see, despite not having been seen, to transmit, despite not having received, to maintain the circle, despite the circle having been broken in the previous generation. To be in yourself, the restoration of the chain, not the first link, which was forged in Eridu, but the link that does not break on your watch. This is what the Sumerian scribes were asking for when they wrote the 8 things in clay. Not for a civilization that got it right, not for a generation of perfect parents, for enough individual links that hold to keep the chain from breaking completely, for enough circles maintained to keep the ambient field from going entirely dark. For you, for this generation, for the children who are here now, who are going through their developmental windows right now, who are either receiving the me or not, whose invisible architecture is being built right now in the specific conditions of the specific households in which they are growing up. The children are not waiting for civilization to reform itself. They are not waiting for the culture to change or the institutions to improve or the economic conditions to make genuine parental presence easier. They are in their developmental windows right now. The windows are open right now. The clay is wet right now. Whatever is going to be impressed into that clay is being impressed right now. In the 10,000 ordinary moments of the ordinary day, in the way the parent looks up or does not look up, in the quality of attention that is brought or not brought to the meal, to the bedtime, to the conflict, to the play, in whether the child's communication is received or not received, whether the bid is returned or left unanswered, whether the wider perception is honored or denied, right now, in ordinary time, in ordinary households, in the unremarkable dailiness that is, the Sumerians said, the most cosmically significant space available to human beings. This is where the project lives. This is where it has always lived. Not in the temples or the palaces or the schools or the textbooks. In the ordinary, unremarkable moment when a parent looks at a child and chooses to actually see. 5,000 years ago, in a city that should not exist, in a civilization that appeared fully formed from somewhere that the historical record does not fully account for, scribes pressed these words into wet clay. The fate of the newborn is written in the face of its mother. They pressed it carefully, in the cuneiform that recorded the me. They dried the tablet. They filed it in the library. And they trusted that the clay would outlast whatever was coming. The invasions, the collapse, the burial under the desert, the centuries of silence, the excavation, the translation, the long journey from the marshes of southern Iraq to wherever you are right now, reading or hearing these words. The clay lasted. The words survived. The message arrived. What you do with it is the next chapter. Not in history. In the household that is yours. In the relationship that is already there, waiting for the quality of your seeing to meet it. In the child who is carrying the divine portion and transmitting it continuously, whether you receive it or not, the transmission is happening. The question is only the reception, and the reception begins the moment you look up. Everything that was written in clay was written for this moment. Everything that was buried in the ruins of Eridu was buried for this recovery. Everything that the Anunnaki gave us, if they gave it, if the giving was real, if the divine portion is what the Sumerians said it was given for this purpose, that we would be present enough and aware enough and willing enough to be changed, that the project they began could continue. The project is the child is the project, and the circle is the thing. The circle is always the thing. Maintain it.